organizing everything, and especially today's conversation. Then next, maybe by order of appearance, Tim Ivison is here. And also, please feel free to unmute and kind of say hi. Tim is a writer and artist based in Los Angeles. He works on the history and political ecology of cities, and he teaches liberal arts and history theory courses at SCI-Arc and the Art Center College of Design. He was a Mellon Research Chair at the CCA and, while he was completing his PhD at the London Consortium. Hi, Tim. Good to see you.
Hello. How are you?
Next, John Cooper joined us, history theory faculty at SCI-Arc. He has his MArch from Princeton, PhD in art history from Yale University, and he's currently zooming in from the UK, so the very dark background. Hi, John.
Yeah, hi.
It must be still not too late, but it's getting there.
Dark room, that's all.
John will be also kind of jumping through different sessions today, so he'll be in and out. Next, we have Kavior Moon. Hi, Kavior.
Hi, everyone.
She's an art historian. She received her BA in visual arts from Columbia, PhD in art history from UCLA, where she wrote her dissertation on the conceptual artist Michael Asher and the expanded field of contemporary art institutions, like super relevant to some of our students' projects. So I'm very happy, Kavior, that you are here this morning.
Good.
She teaches in the liberal arts curriculum at SCI-Arc. And then last but not least, we have Augustina Gonzales Cid. Welcome, Augustina. You are our kind of external guest today. She did her SMRCS at MIT with Miho Mezeru and Rafi Siegel. Her thesis was titled Food Network, Design for a New Territorial Logic, which is kind of amazing for a lot of the things that we'll see this morning, I think. She's the planning secretary of the city of Rosario in Argentina. She's also faculty at University Nacional of Rosario. Welcome, Augustina.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
It's so good to see everybody. I think throughout the morning, we may also be joined by Eric Ganui, who is the research coordinator and history theory faculty at SCI-Arc, and Marika Trotter, who is the history and theory coordinator at SCI-Arc. Both have been working with our students, as well as John Cooper. They've been working kind of in Thesis as a very interesting coordination and collaboration between design faculty and history and theory faculty. So this is going to be a really lively discussion. We have 9 students this morning. We kind of have basically, at this point, since I've taken up 8 minutes, we have about 19 minutes per student.
The Zoom.
I see also.
So you guys, I think we have Eric Moss. We have him wrong in this group. So I'm moving him to the right group, so you can see him. Eric, are you there? I just emailed you your group number 3. I ask everybody, please mute yourself. Rob, I see you're not muted. I see some people that is not muted, so please mute yourself upon entering this room.
If Eric Moss does join us, Eric Moss, of course, architect here in LA, kind of a force of nature, and also was director at SCI-Arc for many years and teaches design. So Eric, we welcome you too if you'd like to return.
I think he left. I'm going to go to his group to see that it's all fine. Bye, guys. I'm coming later.
Thanks, Florencia. I pass the mic to Zeina.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So before we start, I'm just going to paste a few links. So the live stream link, and then I think Anna also, but my group has a mural board that I just pasted the link here. And so the students will be presenting for about hopefully 5 minutes. We'll have a discussion for about 18 minutes, as Anna was saying, and then you can follow any kind of board. If you need to zoom in and kind of look more closely, you can use the Miro app link. Okay, so I have 3 students today: Ovgu, Wendy, and Sam. Actually, Sam is going second, so Ovgu, Sam, Wendy. And the 3 of them are working on very different topics and very different, also, I would say, approaches to a design thesis, but also to architecture. Sam, so I'm going to very quickly give you a kind of a summary. Sam is working on ceramics and the history of spolia. He's designing kind of strange bathing residency in Coastal Valley in California. Wendy is working on the US Embassy in Havana specifically and the concept of perception. And Ovgu is working on meme culture, and she's designing a digital game, which she will begin by describing. I'm not going to take too much time because I want to leave longer time for discussion. So Ovgu, you can take it from here. You ready?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Ovgu. So just to begin with, my thesis has an Instagram account if anyone is interested. So let me share my presentation now. My thesis is called Deal With It. One thing that I started to comport in the beginning was the fact that I problematized architecture just having a tendency to be monosemic, which means positing one solution, having one architectural legacy, and interacting with one architectural history. I wanted to take it into a polysemic place so that it can exist and interact with a world where everything exists at once and everything has multiple meanings. So that led to this thesis becoming something in that it started to posit an architecture that does not depend on canons, like the singularity of canons. As of now, it's still in a place where it's anti-canon, but I want to move it ultimately as a goal to a non-canonical architecture and completely circumnavigate it. So the way I started to do it was to look at culture phenomena and like see if there's something there that could give existential integrity to architecture. This is what I had for my midterm. And one culture phenomenon was memes. So the thing that's fascinating about memes is that it is polysemic. It does everything. It's political commentary, it's poignant, it's naive, it's cynical, it's low res, but it's high res production. And then it communicates, it feeds on, it takes on, it establishes cultures. So I started to look at memes and understand how they take things from the words and then start to make themselves and then go on and infect other things because they're after all Bible. So this is one meme that I started to work with. And I started to, first of all, construct it in 3 dimensions and then took it into image production. And as a result, I had a set of rules and techniques with which I could start to go and infect things by myself. And one thing that's quite fascinating about it is this, even though the production, the outcome is low res, the production itself, like you need high res skills to be able to do this. You need significant amount of image making skills. So this is one result, pertains to the one that I just showed you. And how I started to do this was to go to like the equivalent of low res architecture. Like I had to go back 250 years and go to the very basics of architecture, identify single elements, say, this is a dome, this is a text, this is a nave, this is a column, and this is a pedestal. Then I took the techniques that I had and I started to infect them and then come up with like new architectures through that production technique. And then you can say this, you can see the same thing, ornaments, roof, trees, tier, pedestals, they all become infected and they become like a meme/internet equivalent of what they used to be. So this is the object that I showed you. It's an allusion to the fact that my thesis is called Deal With It. That's what the meme is called. So this is another example of it. And then as a result, I now have a set of 12 objects/architectural assets, or like depending on the scale, they can be buildings too. And that's the first establishing of the clash. Like you take something that is quite architectural, didactic, and then you just infect it with a completely different set of rules. My second clash was to establish what kind of universities guys were going to exist in. And I found this niche in the internet where young women were positing quite hardcore political commentary using naive, like feminine and like seemingly innocent aesthetics. So like you can see here, and this is all coming from this aesthetic lineage called the magical girl genre. This is like a cartoon/aesthetic based on like young women going out in their magical forms and like saving the words. And I started to take this like clashing of this seemingly quite innocent aesthetic with a very complex commentary, and started to like construct a universe that had those components too. So I started to take the physical assets that are in this universe and then started to do the same digital production started to apply them as textures. As you can see, I started to play with the textures. And then I started to also use fonts and backgrounds that came from this universe. So that's the thing that I'm presenting this in. And this is what I had for my midterm. You can see the colors, you can see the stickers, you can see the fabric, you can see like the overwhelming feminine, naive and innocent, but then there's still like a lot of commentary going on in what is happening there. So this is my midterm model. Which brings us to what is the commentary? So if you paid attention, there's a heavy text component, like memes deposit meaning, which come through text. And then there's also like a lot of text happening in like the architecture that I was looking at too. Going back to this, you can see that it had a text. And then from here, I started to take these objects and started to clash them with text, which means I started to take the meme text and then clash it with architecture jargon to see if there's anything that can open up new meanings, like break something new. So you can like design authorship of Furby, coffin party, my favorites, intersection of design and pineapple, tectonics of swole dodge, phenomenology of Salt Bay. And yeah, these are the examples. And this is what my Instagram account consists of. So this is my Instagram account, which brings us to the final question. So these seem to be, as of now, like very static, like the perfect conditions, but for them to be able to like adapt to the meme dynamics, they have to go on and infect other things. So how do they go viral, and like in what setting do they do these? I actually have three posits. One of them is making a game, putting these objects and then manipulating the text, the objects, so that you actually get new things that you can produce. I don't have a visual representation of that as of yet. The second one is, of course, putting on social media, which is the most obvious one, and see where this is going to go. The last one is like putting these in urban context at a building scale, making them like so inescapable that something is going to happen. People are going to interact with this, and then this is going to take on something new by itself. So that was my presentation. Thank you everyone for listening, and yeah, we can start the discussion. Thanks again.
Ovgu, do you want to share your mural just to jumpstart conversation?
Thanks, Ovgu. And we have 10 minutes for discussion or thereabouts. So to our guests, jump right in.
Well, I guess I could maybe start with a question, and it has to do with kind of clarification. Super fun and playful in terms of the way in which you're taking meme to try to break down this notion of a canon and busting the bounds of like a discipline, but just to be clear, so where you ended up was that you're not quite sure what the ultimate form this will take, whether it will be ultimately a game in which you set up the structures and the kind of operations that will sort of characterize how you're memeing something, or if it'll be some kind of presence on an online platform, like a particular social media platform, or whether you're going to use this idea to produce ultimately something that exists as a physical form in the urban landscape. Is that right? Because I feel like those different outcomes would produce a very different form in terms of how it's operating, like what space, virtual or physical, like an urban social, like physical social reality, concrete reality. They just seem very, very different. So they're like, it's like, I feel like that is a major decision to make in terms of like what effect, like the purpose for using this notion of meme to, in a kind of like a viral way, to kind of mix together different disciplines in order to confuse architecture, like as a discipline.
Yeah. I completely agree with everything you say, which is why the land of end of the presentation is very open. Like I'm still working on figuring out where the setting is going to be for these guys to go viral and infect others. But as you say, like all three of them have very different outcomes, and yeah.
I wonder if you might think about. I like the whole thought process, and I like all the elements, but some of it is not matching up for me. And I don't mean that. Sorry, I'm trying to like wind up my brain. It's always hard to be the first one, right? This idea of anti-canonical architecture strikes me as kind of going against the grain of what you're actually doing, because memes, I think, although at first memes appear to have nonsensical content and almost like frustrate the idea of like serious culture or building any kind of coherent system of thought. But I think that the longer that we've lived with memes or expressed ourselves through memes, they're starting to take on a highly structured, almost Baroque structure of meaning, right? Their own grammar. And in fact, I would say, and it's actually your project that got me thinking about this, I would say they're taking on a kind of a cult structure of meaning. And something about your reference points, I mean, there's the LaCue drawing, but I was also thinking Labrouste. And the further we got through your presentation, I was also thinking of the Masonic orders, right? Like this is a very Masonic project, because you're taking essentially like nonsensical information and building it up into iconic, monumental, highly ordered forms of knowledge, which at the base of them are mystical, right? And nonsensical. And so there's something like deeply Masonic about this presentation to me, which I think is fascinating. But I don't think that is anti-canonical. I think it's maybe a kind of neo or radically different kind of canon that's being constructed. And the infected mushroom, I think, is a good metaphor for that. But I think this totally, it points in a way to where it seems like online culture is going, which is increasingly towards the occult. And people that I can, I'm thinking of that, like people like, oh my God, I need more coffee or something. The curator at the Serpentine, the guy who runs the digital department, and also Troy Conrad Thieren at the Guggenheim. Both these guys have been working on digital culture in architecture for a long time, and they're both like obsessed with the occult now. It's like a little black hole that you get sucked into. And I just wonder if that was something you were thinking about. Ben Vickers, sorry, that was the name of the guy I was thinking of. And Ben Vickers has has a publishing imprint now that deals only in poetry and the occult. I wonder if that was something that you were consciously thinking about, or if it's something that just kind of organically happened as you started playing with these symbols, or if it's something you actually want to downplay. I don't know. How would you respond to that?
There's a couple of things that I can say about that. So the anti-canonical thing, I am leaning more towards to a non-canonical thing, like as in like not going against something and define yourself as the against, but like completely circumnavigated. The second thing is that like you pointing out how this is like occult, like they're cults. Memes really have niches on the internet, and even like these niches are the pockets of internet that push this culture out of reach once they start to establish an order. Like it seems like the more order memes establish, the more people appear to actually come up with new stuff to confuse those rules. So like it's like the cyclical thing. And you like pointing out the Masonic order, like there's definitely like an iconic element to all of these, and we actually started to refer to these as meme chimes at one point, but they kind of dropped it. And the Masonic order was actually something that came out of that. So like every single point that you're making, I did interact with all of them. And I am actually very happy that this is kind of organically coming out without me necessarily having to present all of those ideas. These are things that I have gone through, but first of all, it's a bit too much information. And second, I am definitely open to categorizing them and then seeing if there's something that could be interjected into this so that, I don't know, it has a more coherent or existentially integral direction.
Well, now I'm thinking about the title, and it seems like what you're trying to say is, there's this process by which meaning is made and by which, symbols become knowledge, but then you look at the final product and it's not clear what that knowledge is. And essentially it seems like your response is deal with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
It's completely accurate. Yeah. Any other comments?
Well, I agree with the comments. I also need some coffee, and it's very hard to begin with. To just start be the first to present in a review, but I think it's very interesting, and maybe in a thesis that every project is so different. I think it's important to maybe to start with a general idea when you tell your project, because for the reviewers it's sometimes hard to catch up, and when you're finally getting all the information, it's like the end of the presentation. So maybe the way you present it could help the reviewers understand for the next time. But thank you for the presentation.
Ovgu, maybe I can jump in as well. I thought it was really well developed from the miniature review, and I appreciate seeing all the new work. I have two thoughts, one that has to do with the design of the pieces, and the other one has to do with the way in which these things land in the city. In terms of the design, I think because you're looking at Le Coeur, the way Le Coeur's structure works is kind of gravitational, or you can think of it as text, which is to say that on the page we see a kind of elevation of certain things, so you're always seeing it frontally. But you can also think of it as stacking one thing on top of the other. So gravity plays a role in thinking of the symbolism and how it stacks up into a text. In terms of your design process, I think that gravity and frontality might not play such a central role. So how do you take a meme out of this kind of 2D space and into the 3D space? And also, how do you blow up the idea of something stacking gravitationally? Because it seems not such an important thing for a kind of purely digital, construction of the piece. So those are the two things that I would question in terms of how you stack information and how it kind of comes together. And then to the second point of the urban space, as soon as you place these things in the city, that idea of three-dimensionality and kind of something that you can really float around becomes really fundamental, because at this point, the meme is no longer read frontally, it's really understood spatially. And so I think kind of taking it out of some of these tropes of reading it a certain way becomes kind of important. So you should be able to see it from the worm's eye view, from the helicopter view, from the front and the back, almost equally. And so I'm looking also at Tim's text that's revolving behind him. It's a sort of thing that you need to do to your project, take it a little bit out of gravity and also out of legibility from left to right, so that it becomes a little bit more like a balloon. Sorry, that's my timer, but I hope anybody has another comment, jump in. We can do.
I just have a very quick comment based on the last word you said, balloon, which is, and Ovgu, I'm not sure if we've spoken about this previously, but I'm reminded of the inflatable union rats that
We did.
yeah, right, that workers unions I've seen them in New York City, I don't know if they operate in other areas, will put this kind of scary rat that's like 1.5 stories tall, and they'll situate it in front of the corporate headquarters of companies who are known to abuse labor rights and with whom the unions are in a kind of contestation. and it's, you know, it's inflatable, mobile, provocative.
We lost John.
Mentioned that within cities, and I, you know, because I really appreciate your engagement with these new forms of kind of subcultural, political, social media, and I also agree with what Anna's saying about the you know, the kind of concrete nature of the object and the necessity. And I think this is such a great move to spatialize and three-dimensionalize the meme. But I wonder whether you need some kind of intermediary materiality between the digital image and the building. And it seems to me something like the inflatable. It's also, I mean, completely realistic to make some of these crazy, you know, shark encrusted domes in inflatables. So it takes some kind of a gesture like that would, I think, engage a kind of new level of literalism and realism in the project, both in terms of its materiality and in terms of its politics.
Those two inputs were amazing. That's going to help a lot. Okay.
Thank you. I think
we should move on.
Do you want to say one last thing?
No, not necessarily. Like, I think everything was very helpful, and I'm going to leave the floor to Sam. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see the PowerPoint with the 3 animations? Okay. So my name is Sam. For my thesis, I've been looking into the history of ceramics and spolia as a way of designing a recreational and archaeological site in California. Sorry, my script just. So ceramics is an artificial geomorphology which indexes the history of collective life. Its discovery as a craft technology populates all corners of the globe at multiple times. Although ceramics seems to have just originated everywhere, politics and geography greatly determines the production and evolution of this technology. The ceramic vessel is a proto-tectonic which enables sharing, storing, collecting, and decoration within our daily lives. The 3 images that you see are representations of reconstructing ceramic fragments, digital fragments, and also kintsugi, which is a Japanese practice of joining ceramic fragments with gold. So I started kind of breaking apart what a ceramic space is and what is the sort of history of spaces which are completely ceramic. So looking at the bathroom, one immediately recognizes the relationship between control, cleanliness, and sensuality. The tiled bathroom is of interest because it performs as a hygienic surface while also asserting a space of complete control through the orthogonal grid, the idea of whiteness, even gender separation establishes the psychosexual regime. So in this animation on the left, you see different designs of an ergonomic fixture, a French chamber pot, and finally this sort of proto-toilet paper Roman passoi, which is like a ceramic disc. And on the right is sort of a slideshow of this sort of domestication of ceramic fixtures in mid-century American catalogs. And so combining this idea of cleanliness and hygiene with maybe an idea of assembly that's not, I have been looking into the typology of spolia as a way of recognizing the application of different fragments. I began researching tectonic assemblies, which dismantle and recycle other building elements to form new architecture with new meaning. The fragments are extracted from sacked cities and reconfigured as macro aggregates. The image in the middle, you see the sort of reinterpretation of different elements. The Medusa head is inverted and used as a plinth. Which brings me to my first attempts at combining this idea of assembly, a spalia assembly, and the kind of collection of different fragments and sort of perspective assemblies of the different fragments. So I've been using plaster and creating these sort of digital spalia fragments through CNC and 3D printed molds, and creating partial enclosures which utilize different loose fit and points of connection. In tandem with the casting and spalia assembly models, I've been CNCing plaster. And so the image on the left shows the sort of raw state of the plaster blocks that I've been milling. And this is a picture of them in their warehouse. So the bags of plaster on the left is about 15 feet high. And then the image or the drawings on the right are technical spec drawings, which were the topography of these drawings or of this section is limited by the parameters of the mill. And so the step over and the step down is basically creating this elevation. And so these are the different CNC molds that I had made from those plaster blocks. So as my proof of concept, I started by looking at different regions in California that have a sort of geothermal access. I knew that I wanted to develop a sort of thermal or bathing structure. And so after looking through the sort of different adjacent sites, I came across this region called the Coso Hot Springs, which is completely fascinating because it's also on a US naval base. And so the area surrounding the Coso Hot Springs holds more petroglyphs than any other region in North America. Identified sites have been recognized as a national monument in 1935, prohibiting accessibility, vandalism, and theft of the petroglyphs. So here is a site, or here is a map of my site. The green pools are represented in this sort of staggered satellite view, which is overlaid on a geology map. I've been using different LiDAR scans and sort of historical documents to start reconstructing the sonography of a site, which is really very difficult to access. So on the left, this is like a form that you'd have to fill out to go to the site. In the middle is sort of this pamphlet from the adjacent Matarango Museum, which kind of documents both of the artifacts, but also how quickly this site is changing because it rests on a tectonic fault line. The actual sizes of the baths are changing in real time. And then on the right is an image from the late 70s of when different geologists from NASA were surveying this same area as a way to pre-visualize what surveying other landscapes would be like outside or outside of Earth. And so I've been using this sort of different open source data from the USGS and GIS to create a new map of my site and a new topography to start developing a new hot spring collective. And so I found these, a documentary of my site, and I've been running different scenes through a photogrammetry software, which takes the frames and kind of reconfigures them into a new landscape. It's a little frozen. So this image here shows my first program on my site, which is the mud pits. And there is a changing room, which is made out of adobe, and it's surrounded by these different colored pools. On the left is an image of a plaster model, which utilizes different types of assembly, from the kind of over-grouted pieces, and then pieces that are just stacked dry. Using details from the existing ruins of the site, I've been cutting and rearranging them as a sort of spalia technique. The second program on my site is using the ruins of a restaurant. Can't go to my next slide. So here's a sort of panning shot going through the landscape. One kind of interesting thing that happened out of this process of the photogrammetry is how the steam from the photographs is, it becomes a sort of digital volume, or the atmosphere has a sort of materiality.
Hey, Sam, I want to give you a heads up. We have 8 minutes left.
Okay, here's some.
10.
Okay, details of the other two buildings. Here's my midterm model. And this, in the steam room, which is also on this sort of campus. I'll just read the last sort of paragraph, which summarizes my thesis. The thesis develops a temporal colony, weekdays only, 7 cars maximum, which distributes geothermal energy of the coastal volcanic region into a network of pools, enclosures, and environments. The ceramic architecture redirects energetic flows by embedding a scaffold conduit throughout existing ruins and fumaroles. Drawing on methods of assembly that document in spalia, the existing ruins of the site are uprooted and remixed. New scenographies emerge. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. If you could share your mural for the discussion, or you could keep these images, whatever works.
Okay, I'll share my Miro board.
But just a quick advice, because you rushed through your models, I think if we could look at those more closely, yeah.
Yeah, that was, yeah. So in this model, I used the sort of fragment, this detail that I've been studying that was in one of the existing ruins, and I've 3D printed just a portion of it, and have been casting it and breaking it and reconfiguring it to make this sort of loose structure.
Okay, leave it at that.
Yeah.
I just noticed that we're also joined by Francisco Pardo. Hi, Pancho. How are you?
Hey, how are you? How are you guys? Sorry for the delay.
No, it's great.
In a meeting. Thank you for accepting me here.
We're super happy to have you. I think you'll probably be jumping around this morning, but yeah, just as a quick introduction, you're probably in Mexico City right now.
Yes.
Everything's going okay?
Well, more or less, everything is kind of stopped, I guess, same as in the US. We're the worst part of the world now, right? All this North American area, yes.
Yeah, well, welcome so much. Augustina, I think you unmuted yourself, so I pass the mic to you.
Yes, I wanted to ask Sam, what would you think is the most important part of your thesis? I mean, is it about the details of how you put these pieces together, or is it about how you make with those pieces the architecture, maybe to if maybe that's where you should put the most effort for the last piece of the semester, right? Once you decide what's your main focus. I don't know if I'm being clear, sorry.
I mean, I think I've been focusing on the details because I was interested in Spalia and kind of focusing in on something that's like more of a small fragment and detailing that, and then assembling the fragments to create a massing. So I do kind of want to zoom out now and make kind of more enclosures instead of more details.
Or sorry, maybe both. Maybe you can go even closer to a real detail of these things put together, but also, since you're talking about different buildings and different programs, like show the master plan of the site. Maybe both scales are important.
If I may jump in just real quick, I think that's a really important question, and I do think that the challenge of this thesis is to present its multiple scales at once, simultaneously. And I think part of what Sam has been interested in, and I mean, especially in relation to ceramics, is that they do have sort of social and cultural impacts at multiple scales. So the scale of the cup, the scale of the room, the scale of the building, or building brick or block. And so I think in your presentation, you're attempting to kind of like navigate us through the different scales, but maybe right now they are still kind of living in their own kind of separate worlds. And hopefully eventually they'll start to come together.
Yeah, I think that that's important to tell that the different scales, maybe even in one image showing the different scales. Well, that's your work, but I think it's very interesting. Thank you.
This may be somewhat related, but I was also wondering how important the pre-existing use and identity of each of the fragments and the kind of specific space that they came from were. I think you mentioned that the Koso hot springs is on military ground, but then you also mentioned that some of the fragments that you're using were part of a restaurant. And so some of the questions that I had that weren't really clear just from your short presentation were, what were the fragments that we're using? They were from restaurants, but then other kinds of buildings. And the specific use of the site for the program for that colony, is that also still on military ground? Or yeah, just like the pre-existing identities of the fragments that you're using, and then the specific use of the space that you were planning to build upon weren't very clear to me. And I would imagine that each of those things would be important, but then maybe they aren't important to you in some way, which would also be good to hear about why they're not important.
Yeah, this site has had many sort of occupations, and so it sort of started as this sacred land for the Shoshone sort of indigenous tribes as a hot spring that was used for healing. But then it became a health resort in the early 1900s, and it wasn't until 1935 that it became a military base. And so thinking about the different uses of both like the site and the land, but also the sort of the different uses of what the fragments are kind of what I'm interested in. And so when you said, like, does it matter if the fragment or if the ruins are still the same in the final kind of construction, I think that I would like to change them in the same way that the Medusa head has been like rotated in the Spalia image that I showed.
Sam, that was time, but we can do a couple more minutes. Pancho, Florencia is asking me to send you to another thesis group.
Oh, did I go?
So I put the link in the chat.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
But I hope to
Sorry.
see you soon. It's very good to see you, Pancho.
See you all. Thank you.
The link is in the chat, so I think you'll be able to.
Yes.
Okay.
Just click it. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Ciao.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say that based on what some of the other comments, actually connecting this question of like what you think is important in the project, and then the question of site. It seems like in terms of the formal project, there's a lot of like interesting questions to be resolved. But the question of scale did occur to me that the scale of the spolia that you're using, it almost starts to challenge the category of spolia, because it's no longer really just a building element. It's almost at the scale of a pavilion or architecture itself. And I wonder if you'd looked at follies at all, at the history of follies. And both of those things, when I kind of connected follies and spolia, I realized, well, I didn't realize, but it highlighted, underlined this way in which they both make reference to history, but also tend to obfuscate, both, kind of indicate, but then obfuscate the historical origins of the project. And I wonder, this becomes an interesting question because you've chosen such a historically charged site, right? So it inevitably asks questions about how these historical reference points and these historical motifs, if you will, relate to the actual history. So there's a kind of implied history, or a kind of playfully obfuscated or referenced history, and then there's the actual history. And I wonder if the project is trying to like open up aleatory readings, or actually trying to tell a coherent narrative, and what that narrative might be, if in fact that's the case. So to resolve some of those narrative links in the final might be a useful way to kind of walk us through the project.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I think that I could see all these sort of connections between these different elements, and they all kind of exist within the site, but then the sort of retelling of the narrative is, yeah, I think that's something to really work on.
I also wanted to jump in and say that the new models are very beautiful, and that although you have a very broad kind of sweep through the site, and almost a kind of like an uber temporal kind of dimension to all the different peoples who occupied it, I do think ultimately the beauty of the project lies in the kind of aesthetic of the things that you're building, like of the architecture. And I think that the new models, maybe of the three that you showed, the first and the third, to my eye, look really beautiful. And just the craft with which you've put it together, and the link to the kind of cast of plaster and then the milling process, those are the things that right now stand out to me the most. I think that those models are really, they're like, because they're both precise and informal, there's something incredibly powerful about their form. So I really do hope that you can kind of, I know that there is a kind of push to both zoom out and zoom in at this moment, and maybe you'll do both, but I do hope that you develop these buildings architecturally in a kind of very traditional sense of like actually thinking about them as buildings. And I really do wonder what it means for these elements to be so heavy and so large and like manipulated at such a large scale. I especially loved that warehouse image where you show us the material in bags, and then of course the heaviness of the plaster. And I know that the kind of in the background, all the wars with the shop for actually allowing you to like mill this material, all of that, and the heaviness of the backdrop of the construction for something that only takes 2 seconds to present is really huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say like Sam made a leap this week, and finally I pushed him to move into the building scale, and so I'm so glad that this is coming through. And I will say that to answer maybe Tim's question, because I think it's really important, or maybe thought, to some extent, I think you are discovering a new form of Spolia that is much more embedded in computational processes. And that's why I think Anna's comment in some ways like ties this together, that you are developing a way of working that I think right now you're not being explicit about. You're being it's sort of sitting in the background, which is also fine. And hopefully the buildings and the way you design them will speak to that. But yes, there is a highly computational process there that is then that then leads to or turns into a very almost like archaic aesthetic. So you are curating the trajectory and the path of the CNC mill and its bids. You are curating every single bid that you're using. You're curating its curvature and how it's moving across the plaster. You're designing all of that, and then you cast it and you sort of like break it apart, right? And so I think the marriage of these two ways of working is what is making these models and this way of working more sort of original and different, let's say, than Spolia in its sort of historical sense. And hopefully maybe in the next discussions we can push this further, because I do think that it's really key part of your thesis. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and Sam, your presentation was a bit too long, but it's because there's so much there, which I think is great. So any last comments before we move on to Wendy?
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks, Sam.
Wendy, you're up.
Hi, I'm going to share my screen if you can let me know if it's working. And then also, I'm going to show some drawings that don't really look that great in PowerPoint. There are nicer ones on our Miro board if you want to take a look there. Zeina, maybe you can share the link with us. Okay, hello, my name's Wendy.
I just posted it on the...
All right, cool, thank you. Hello, my name is Wendy, and my thesis will be focusing on the performance and design of embassies and the U.S. Embassy to be specific. My site is in Havana, Cuba. So the U.S. relationship with the U.S. and Cuban diplomatic relationship is a complex one. The U.S. Embassy sat empty for decades, and just recently during the Obama administration resumed its consular activities. Finding photos or plans for this was extremely difficult, and I had a breakthrough about 2 weeks ago where I found these unrestricted photos, 1,200 of them. It's been the highlight of the summer for me, at least. And these are just a few of these contact sheets that I found, which really give us an idea of how it's constructed and how big it is. And then the kind of activities that happened in there from 1951 to more recently in the early 2000s. So when the U.S. designs and builds embassies and consulates, it refers to something called the OBO code, which is short for Overseas Building Operation. You'll find occupancy requirements, protection features, finishes, energy efficiency. And the Department of State and this agency really has an impact on how we're seen in a global stage through the embassy typology. And to really understand this, I created an archive of U.S. embassies that are listed on the usembassy.gov website. There's about 135, and this is a contact sheet of all the ones that I found. And through this visual exercise, I noticed there's a difference on how the Department of State in foreign territories, their particular building typology, the embassy, how it's presented in foreign territories. In some cases, it acts as a cultural messenger, and others a show of force, and a few an apathy. I pulled anomalies or patterns of deviations from the image data set. And a pattern that I noticed is that the U.S. Embassy is typically the location to protest its anger or dissatisfaction with the United States government. and it becomes a civic stage. So this is one of the things I'm introducing is this theater lexicon, where the embassy is somewhere you go to perform. And as we understand, the US embassy is a place of diplomacy that bridges two nations and its citizens, and that diplomatic relationships are always in flux. So the current embassy typology deals with the present in the host city and the struggle of equilibrium in a society that is constantly changing. So this is kind of where I started my design earlier this semester. What you see on the screen is my miniature model that consisted of an object, a mirror, a two-way mirror, and a beam splitter image, or beam splitter class. These are some of the materials I've been testing by stacking, moving, rotating to create a series of physical acts that can produce a semiotic and optical effect that will be documented through videos, plans, and images. And this is a GIF of all of these kind of in their more traditional applications. So I'm physically testing and analyzing the relationship from my miniatures materials to their cultural and political implications. It's two-way mirrors and surveillance, beam splitter glass, and the presidential teleprompter, and also creating a mechanized rig that will help the seamless movement of these optical planes, which will lead to the organization of program, which is diverse and unsurprisingly includes a lot of hidden rooms. And this is my midterm model, which has everything in a nice organized rig that helps me move these materials. So the first thing I noticed through these tests is the effect of simultaneity. In order for these effects to be convincing, the conditions must be dynamic, not always visible or always hidden, but rather always both. And the second is the gaze, where and how is the assembly is viewed, or rather who was the audience. I'm using a multi-plane rig, which is commonly used for animations, where you have multiple planes fixed on a rig and a series of movable parts with mirrors, film, projectors, lights. And the model is a schematic, so it's operable. So the reason that I chose the Havana site is there's this one particular episode that compelled me to choose it. The US used their embassy to broadcast pro-democracy messages from their facade. Cuba responded by the erection of a field of flags to block the embassy. And the field of flags poles sits in a plaza named the Anti-Imperialist Plaza. So this site already has a stage. And here is a Google map, which shows the United States. Right in front of it is the Anti-Imperialist Plaza. So my intervention is on the tower. Currently, there's a tower and a plinth. I'm just intervening on the tower. I'm using this rig to kind of move all of the parts and then add other planes in between to create these effects. It invites the people of Cuba to come into the stage or behind the stage and to participate. This is a diagram of all of the pieces that I'm using, and these ones go back to the materials that I first looked at, which was the one-way mirror, the blast-proof mirror, the blast-proof concrete, pulley system, track system, and anti-eavesdropping film. And right here, this is a diagram that shows the actors that will be participating in and the activity that happens within the parts of the building. And these ones can be seen on the Miro board a lot closer and nicer. This is a GIF with all of the pieces kind of being assembled. So we have a track system, we have films, we have mirrors, we have glass, and we have the facade and all the systems, the pulley system, the truck system, and all that. And this is an interior shot. So what I'm hoping to have by the end of thesis is what the role of the U.S. embassy should be, and what is the image of the U.S. abroad. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Can you share your mirror, please?
Yes. It's stuck. Okay. Oh, are you sharing?
If you can do it, it's better.
Okay. So the top half is kind of the research part of it, and the bottom half is the most recent and the design.
Wendy, this model is amazing. And I don't know, did I miss it? Did you show us the model in action?
I don't have a video of it. I definitely need to like capture it. I don't have it in motion, but it's operable. It moves.
Do you have it next to you? Can you redirect your camera?
It's in my car.
Oh, I was going to say, you're like the magician who shares the trick, but not, I mean like shares the behind the scenes, but not the trick itself.
Right. So one of my hopeful deliverables for the final is to have like the model a little bit bigger and mechanized. So hopefully I'm just going to be building on it. I will show that one for the final.
I do think that you should look at magicians and kind of just like watch them, how they operate. There needs to be a little bit of drama in how you present the project beyond the Miro board, where in a way it's almost like a how-to manual.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have a feeling that, you know, the project is so much about optics and the kind of optical illusions. We need to be a little bit more drawn into the effects rather than the methods.
Yes, agreed.
Anna, do you remember during our miniature review, she had OBS and the camera was directed?
Yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Hopefully that this becomes in a more kind of curated way, the final. Yeah.
I love it.
It will return, yes.
That's great. And I just one last comment before I'll let everybody else speak, but you said that it's kind of like a conceptual model because it's really about these layers of effects.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it looks actually like you could take it quite literally.
Mm-hmm.
I do wish that that building section was really the building section. You know, it's kind of...
It is the building section. I'm not sure if I made that clear, but I am putting the building, the tower, on a track system and a pulley system.
But I think maybe this is a discussion about the scale of the rig and the scale of the hardware that maybe Anna's initiating. I'm not sure.
I mean, less so much the movement and more so, let's say, the kind of emptiness and the idea of these layers of elevation as a way to design a project. So something that's not plan-based, but based in almost like a very theatrical and perspectival layering of material, of walls. I thought that was really fantastic.
What did you say is the title of this project?
I don't have a title. I have working titles that I didn't want to, well, I can say them now. They're kind of cheesy. They're rigged, staged, scene change, act drop.
Yes, one of the file names was dress rehearsal.
Yes.
So, I mean, I guess maybe the answer is kind of straightforward, but you ended the presentation by saying this is a proposal for what the embassy should be. Since we're backstage, right? This is midterm. You can. What is it, like, in a sentence? Like, what should the embassy be?
It should be a place. I guess it's hard to do in one sentence. If I had to do in one sentence, it's a place where both the host city civilians and the US can be in a space that no one really has territory over. Does that make sense?
So like a no man's land or a neutral space that's neither Cuba nor the US?
Yes, but I guess it's not that simple because there's this idea of like optical deception. So I'm organizing it so that like anyone can enter through the bottom and kind of go into different levels, but there are some areas that are restricted and just for the US.
It's almost like a gallery in that sense, or a museum. Like a large proportion of the building is given over to like visual experience and discourse. And then there's a kind of backstage office where the bureaucratic business is done, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But will you be designing this space for the backstage bureaucratic functions, or is that not part of your project?
So currently, the tower and the plinth that is currently there, the plinth is used for consular activities. So that's where you get your passport. That's where you go to do all your embassy stuff. So that one, I'm going to leave the program as is, and I'm just doing the intervention on the tower. So I'm not designing that aspect of it because it's already there.
I'm trying to understand. So the different layers that I'm seeing in these diagrams, they're based on a ray splitter, you said?
I'm sorry, what was that?
The different layers of the interior, they're based on this beam splitter, sorry, right?
Right, so it's a two-way mirror, a beam splitter, glass, this really weird stuff called, I think it's RTF film, which is an anti-eavesdropping film that they put on all these government buildings. So it's a layer of all of these things that have this idea of like it should belong in an embassy, and some things that are also spec'd by the OBO.
Okay, but so is their role, I mean, other than, I mean, it has a kind of beautiful aesthetic, but is their role also mostly symbolic, or is this building a kind of optical machine? Like, is it producing a kind of light or a kind of image?
It's supposed to operate as a kind of an optical machine. It's supposed to hide certain places in certain spaces. So civilians and admin or diplomats can be in the same space without actually, like, they can see each other, but they can't be with each other. Like there's kind of like, it's supposed to create like these pockets where it's transparent, but it's not accessible.
That might be interesting to visualize, to kind of understand the different conditions in different parts of the building, if that's possible.
It's easier to do with the physical rig, the actual model, unless in the render. So those will be my next steps.
Wendy, I think you have so many good methods now. Would it make sense to like actually treat it as a building where you draw the plan and section and like explore the program? I mean, I'm just kind of thinking about this as a project that you can begin to render and show us how things kind of, as you move through the corridors, that you kind of disappear or appear in and out of view, and you can hide a lot of things by rendering things in and out of focus, let's say. I remember that in your thesis prep, you looked at the Trojan horse as a kind of structure that hides, or, you know, kind of hides its interior functions from the exterior. And I wonder if that initial kind of thesis still figures here, and you can actually quite explicitly bring those two things together through a series of these views.
That's great. I think some of the discussions also that we were having is how to represent it, because the axonometric view presents this kind of omniscient image of the embassy, and it's fitting to some extent if we were to think about the kind of tradition of a US embassy in its host country. But I also wonder if more calibrated eye-level perspectival views on different floors in different rooms could be a way to start to give us a sense of the optical effects that one might navigate, either a civilian or a diplomat in the space itself, so of the embassy. And I think, so maybe a combo of technical, very sort of like orthographic representations that really detail the rig and the systems and the kind of like gutted infrastructure of the stage. And then next to that, you would have these vignettes, again, that show us appearance and disappearance and deception and blurriness and all of these sort of, this glossary bank that you've worked on for the last couple of months. So I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I'm definitely wondering, I think the GIF is really helpful, but I'm not necessarily sure if the omniscient view is the go-to view or representational view for this project.
Yeah, maybe even you could start with like a key that would go through the range of different opacities and transparencies, like a kind of palette of different optical effects.
That's great. Thank you.
I'd like to ask John to jump in, and then we're running out of time, so we'll probably move on.
Oh yeah, well, very quickly. I mean, I totally agree with it seems to me you've produced a like an optical device, a visual implement, and I think you should use it. I think you should deploy it. And I don't know whether you had plans to like photograph the model with like a keyhole camera, because I feel to produce an actual optical instrument and then use it to investigate the problem that you're dealing with, that seems to me that's a very kind of serious endeavor. And I think that you've produced something which is capable of functioning in that respect. And I think that to me, that would also, I mean, I totally agree about the drawings, but I also think the form of evidence which your model would produce would be photographic. And so I think you should like believe in it and use it as an optical device in that fashion. I mean, I think we've spoken about maybe previously some of the kind of optical experiments by Diller and Scofidio in the early works, the use of X-ray, the use of scanning. And I think this this implement that you've made should also operate as they do, like for real.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to just one last comment. I love the two extremes, what I see as extremes of this project, that is like very technical in one way with very worked details. So it would be amazing if you could show this like in a closer scale, like very architectonic details, like 1:20 maybe, like really show the details, but also show like the rest were saying, like the poetics of the results, like all these like this very structured materiality, the unmaterial environment that creates in a way. Thank you. It's very interesting. I love it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you.
Let's go close my group. So we're going to move on to Anna's group. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Max, jump right in. I think you're next.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Wendy. That was really great. Everyone so far this morning has been great. My name is Max. Can everyone see the shared screen correctly? This piece is called Resisting Omnipresent Jewels of Doom. The presentation is going to take about 6 minutes to cruise quickly through history situating the project, locating it geographically, and finally talking design decisions. My thesis here imagines a novel form of urbanism that reintroduces a seemingly obsolete technology, life with a horse. I'm learning from the Compton Cowboys, who have shared their knowledge from a community that stands strong against challenge through our city's history. Much of this came from journalist Walter Thompson Hernandez's 2019 book on the Cowboys, but their presence at rallies in recent months have attracted more attention. The modern Cowboys employ a regime of care and maintenance, where the relationship with horses serves to ameliorate our accelerated moment in time, defined by the pace of industry. Urban equestrianism proposes that the tool for remediation of urban strife is the horse. This is a scan of a patent drawing of the winner, a very economically efficient type of barbed wire. It was a controversial method of enclosure that separated the rangeland of the American West into mostly private parcels in the 19th century. Barbed wire fencing keeps migratory people and animals from crossing into pasture land of established farms, eliminating the previously held concept of common land. It works to express an ideology based on restricting collective use, instead empowering selected individuals at the cost of all others. Barbed wire is a device to draw property lines between classes, and was described at the time to be, quote, a dangerous policy of selling off the public domain and allowing the creation of principalities and baronets among a few capitalists. Here's a scan of a surveyor's drawing of Los Angeles in 1849, 1 year before its incorporation, and 2 years before the first Anglo-American was born here. North of Main Street are the city's rectangular blocks mingling with the land's varying topography. You'll see notations for farm plots stretching south of Main Street. This is a drawing made from a satellite map of LA interposed with the map of the ranchos that occupied this region in 1888, giving clues to how the patchwork of today's neighborhoods may have taken shape from agricultural notations on forgotten treaties and uncovered landforms. As new paths are drawn around the city, new territories are created. I'm interested in how these territories can layer frames over each other, where parties will be more affected by another and expressed differently. Although the territory of an internet provider or that of a local gang might overlap in space, they are differently limited in their expression on the street, while the frames contain the existence of both. So here we are at the site of the first project before regional deployment, the site of the thesis architectural expression. For the largest, most intensive building, the stable, we use the site of the Walmart Supercenter. The historical site of the Eagle Tree will be the hitching post. This is the rider's temporary stopping place. The trail will be located along an existing urban infrastructure project, the trench known as the Alameda Corridor. This is the downtown ways artery for containers of goods continuing by land from the city's port in San Pedro. Uninterrupted below-grade tracks stretch 30 miles through the city, 10 of them underground. 1.5 miles long, the trains are driven all day and night by an engineer at the front and back. On either side, above the sheer concrete walls, are our surface streets. Paved streets are tough on a horse's joints, hooves, ears, eyes, nerves, and if a new network of riders can come to be, the streets must accommodate their users. Modernization was the call of asphalt rhizomes as they invaded the city, surfacing earthen pathways to suit the mobilizing industry's fragile and dangerous automobiles. To reinstate different uses, we'll have to reclaim some of these barren pathways to restore the depth of the tender qualities beneath them. So back to the stable. The stable serves as the horse's long-term domestic home, in the case that their rider cannot accommodate the intensity of a backyard stable in dense residential neighborhoods. The big box store does not serve the community. It extracts enterprise and money from it. The widespread implementation of free plan factory warehouse does not serve Walmart's client so much as it serves bulk movement. Really, it is at odds with the body. We find ourselves out of scale, affronted by noise, and exposed. It does not serve the horse either, so it can be removed. We'll get right back to the stable. Over here, sorry. The Hitch's modest site gets only a cursory review here for its most relevant contribution so far. The narrow site focused on enclosure of 20 standing stalls while allowing passage to both entrances. The site plan shows how the drawn lines act as framing and shrouding one another from the scale of the site to the scale of the horse. Here's a study model that we'll use to talk about design decisions, as it contains many of the techniques that will remain. At the top edge of the subject is a two-sided billboard. The left side is a basswood construction that represents a stable. The bottom is a post hitched with a golden horse. Nominally 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 inch thick, the 20-pound urethane foam was cut, sanded, and painted, particularly in the suggested paths and lounging areas. Grass-like foam is glued on the edges of any fixed object and in places where horses would not be likely to graze. Corrugated cardboard with one side peeled off mimics steel roofing that might be used on a barn. The billboard works as a nice backdrop for the scene. From this angle, we can see bedding from the hayloft above covering the floor of the stall. Right outside the stall, planks of wood have been laid on the ground next to the barn's wall, as if resting until they're picked up again to resume some unknown project. The chosen materials dimension, representing 4-inch by 4-inch posts, allows posts to double each other from certain views. While the scale and the medium of the earlier banding technique changed, the practice continues to interpose two images with each other. Shadow and color wash gradients over the basswood and voids. Vertical openings let light and air pass from outside in, which is desirable for the stable. These walls make ambient views beyond both sides of their boundary. Being able to see what occurs on the other side of the wall might contribute more than the wall itself. The design of the stable orientates itself from the large corral, 120 feet in diameter. It operates through concentric rings of fences, barriers that describe the gradual territory shift from less horse to all horse. Design manifests in a tender materiality, sticking along the lines of the digital designs, tall exposed post walls and sweeping thick roofs uniting them. The rings describe the use of each territory, while the architecture frames and gently encloses this wide outdoor space into semi-permeable courtyard areas that open to the surroundings. Inscriptions from the demolished building orientated to the surrounding grid mix the barns stretching across the site. These bands bring the site, once a Walmart supercenter, down to a more desirable scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. I'm just gonna ask some clarification questions. So the site is the Walmart, and to what extent are you intervening in the existing site, and to what extent are you just completely redesigning what's there? It's I don't know, I had trouble following that.
Can you explain the difference between intervening and?
Well, how much are you keeping essentially? Does that make sense?
Yeah, not much.
Okay.
Not much. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that the existing building doesn't actually serve the use.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm proposing to remove it. Yeah.
Can you share your Miro board link?
Yeah, sure. 1 sec. Oops. There we go. Miro board is in the chat.
Could you talk a little bit more about the content cowboys and how you see them as a kind of catalyst for this project, like maybe what role they have now and how you see that either developing or transforming through this intervention.
Yeah, I mean, can you rephrase the question, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's one, I think the immediate reading is that you want to acknowledge both the Compton Cowboys and the idea of kind of urban Western horseback riding as a kind of critique or interpretation of LA's urban space. That'd be one thing. But you could also imagine how a site like this could become the basis for a kind of statement, right, about the future of South LA, and that its future may lay in elements of the past, right, as a kind of reintegration of the landscape, and a deep, like you mentioned barbed wire, and I suppose the implication is that we're kind of rolling back the barbed wire, but I think that you also mentioned paving, and there's a sense that we're kind of depaving the city as a way to kind of save it in a sense. And I have, I have some kind of anecdotal comments, but I just wondered if you want to say anything further about like what kind of future you think that might be, and what role the Compton Cowboys might have in that.
Totally. Yeah, thanks for explaining that so nicely. I think that the thing that has been really interesting about the Compton Cowboys is their persistence to use the city despite it not being particularly accommodating, and still finding like a device within that can actually be more accommodating to the community at question. In this case, we might be talking about themselves, right? The Cowboys themselves, who are the riders through the city, but also indeed other like at-risk populations. I mean, a lot of what they do is mentoring and like teaching kids to ride and so on. And so there's this sort of like nice like interaction with the relative history within the lives of the Cowboys, which has been going since the 80s and 90s, when most of these folks like started riding and have now grown up and are sort of passing on this creating this sort of institutional memory within the city to reshape the sort of material concrete parts of the city in a way that people can also sympathize with. I mean, I think that it's like a really noble and admirable and generally well-liked sort of endeavor. So it holds in that a sort of promise, it's like this sort of, maybe that's what speaks to the catalyzing that you mentioned the first time around, is just sort of like the fact that there are these folks who have actually already done a few decades of this work that we're now, the rest of us are facing because we're engaging with our city differently, we're understanding our city differently, how we use our streets has changed quite a lot. And these are folks who have really actually spent a lot of time getting to know our streets and the best ways to protect the streets, I guess, and ourselves like within them,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's interesting because it strikes me that it might have, I mean, I don't want to distract from the kind of specificity of the site that you've chosen, but it is also relatively close to the LA River. And it does seem like there's been some interesting discussion about the future of the LA River and the rewilding of the LA River that might connect to what could be done in the kind of flats of Compton, for example. And there's also a historical connection. I mean, the LA River used to flood Compton pretty regularly. So there's a kind of historical, geographical connection there. And there's also, it's funny, I was reading this book about Southgate, Becky Nicolaides' book, My Blue Heaven, which is actually about Southgate, which is just to the north. And it turns out that Southgate was originally supposed to be, the land was purchased in order to be a horse and cattle business, raising Angus beef and Arabian stallions. And the guy who bought the land died before he could develop it. And so instead it became this like working class suburb like decades later. But I think that you might also find, yeah, there's traditions in that region that you could probably connect up to as well. I mean, I think the historical aspect is pretty well accounted for, actually. Yeah, another kind of maybe left field reference. I mean, there's something about, I'm kind of fixated on this idea of the kind of making a city that's amenable to the horse and the horseback rider, and what would need to be done, like the kind of depaving or modification. And it strikes me that there's some connection there to maybe the idea of the stop city, which I think, you know, it was a project by Pier Vittorio Aureli with the other architects that he worked with, which I'll find out in a second. But it was, you know, the idea, it was like a kind of revision of Arkazoom's no stop city, right? This idea of a city entirely made of street grids and of total circulation. And there's something implied by this return to horseback riding, which also suggests that kind of like slowing down, creating friction, right? And of actually interrupting the grid, which is also implied by the choice of the Walmart Supercenter, right? Like the whole history of the gateway cities, I mean, since the 1980s, I guess, has been about creating a frictionless ground for the distribution of goods, right? This kind of freight district of warehousing and distribution. Which I think is also very well described in Ed Soja's work on the kind of spatial restructuring of Los Angeles. That may be another reference.
May I ask you to put some of the references in the chat?
Yeah. And I do feel like I'm kind of talking around the project. So if someone wants to speak more directly,
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think those are
fine.
amazing comments, and I'm also using the chat a bit to kind of add some thoughts. But I wanted to ask Augustina to jump in quickly, and I see Eric unmuted, so maybe Eric as well.
I was chatting with Max. If I was asking, following Tim's question about the river and other parts of the area, if this is part of a network or a system, because you started explaining like the past of the whole area, and then it's like you go directly to one plot in the city, and maybe you can take back to that scale of maybe you can find other plots that have the same characteristics of this one, and say, well, this is part of a system. Maybe you develop only one, but you go back to that old map. Maybe you can even overlap this with the current state of the city and start working at that scale. I think it's very interesting.
Cool. Thank you.
I'd like to chime in a little bit. First, I think that like this, I feel like it's time for huge moves in this project that need to happen fast, because something that I've been desperate to see for a while, but that's still not showing up in the way that I want to see it before this is over, is the kind of way that minimal interventions can completely change the kind of the spatial politics of territories. And for that, like, trail has to connect to the stables. The idea of the loop, I think, is a great one, and that the loop traverses different cultural landscapes is absolutely critical, because this is like it's a small, light-handed infrastructural alteration that changes the possibilities of ordinary life in a way that is in this case, highly politicized, because of like the precedence and the location that you choose for it. It can also have to do with things like urban agriculture and the renewal of like center city landscapes, right? But this project would look very different if you were doing it in Detroit. And so I think but it would totally work in Detroit. So I think that the fact that it's LA has to matter really, really on a precise level. The fact of like, what are those neighborhoods like, and what does it do to them to have this there? What does it do to them to have the possibility that like ordinary life might include like kids growing up there, taking a job, working at the stables, and like getting them their parents to get them a horse someday, and like that it could be like just an accessible, practical aspect of like growing up in the neighborhood. And so like that looks like something, it feels like something on the street, and it feels different from a Walmart, but it also probably feels different from the normal commercial streets of that neighborhood as they stand right now. So I want to feel it. I want to get out there and feel it. And I feel like the models and stuff have been so nice that you're still using like the miniatures and so forth. But like, it's time to give us to like, let them touch the dirty realities of real urban landscapes that they would be where you'd be riding through. Like, take us on a ride out of that stable and out into the neighborhood.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of, the final comment, I think Augustina says something very important, which is to overlay those maps and to really visualize this idea of depaving. And we've talked about it, Max, and I know you're working on that. And then to Eric's point, I think that new model that you are presenting is really amazing. And we really want to get inside of the building now. So perhaps all the programs that you're talking about, especially the after school programs and the way in which the building connects back to the community, is something that you have to reintegrate. So really think through the building, not just from the point of view of like a flyover model, but something that allows us to understand it as a building, as a kind of as a program. So just keep developing. I think you're in a really fantastic place. Today's presentation was.
Just one thing, Anna. I was having very similar thoughts to what Tim and Augustina and Eric were mentioning in terms of the building out of different pathways and thinking about how having the ambulatory space and making it hospitable for the horse, which implicitly also means for the rider or for humans. And just one thing that I was thinking about when reading an LA Times article before about the Compton Cowboys was how one of the purposes was not just to teach people how to ride horses, but also it was a way of caring for the horse that was important to the entire program. And I'm just thinking about how one of the important shifts that I see happening in terms of your interest in this project is ideas of care, like the politics of care, how that goes sort of hand in hand with different movements throughout the city, including South Los Angeles, but like more the growth of community gardens and thinking about the rehabilitation and rethinking our relationship to land and how to make it more hospitable for all forms of life. So just
Thank
some
you,
things I was thinking about.
Unfortunately, thank you, Kavior. Unfortunately, we have to move on because we're behind. Robert, are you ready? Thank you for your comments.
Everyone. Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Max. All right, let's just get into it. So the title that I'm using is The Peripheral. And what I'm doing is designing a dance institution that takes shape in the city more as a pattern of infrastructure that mutates the urban environment than an enclosed building that contains stages and other dance facilities. Coupled with this idea of creating a dance institution is pairing it with a heavy aspect of urban gardening and changing the materiality of the spaces that these places are occurring in as a way to change the environment for a more positive impact. Where this project began was a fascination with looking at the backsides of big famous buildings like the Disney Concert Hall in a similar way as if we were to look at a portrait of the back of somebody's head. And so to return to Los Angeles, there's many examples of this space in the city, like the sort of valley that's created between the Raymond C. Courtine School and the Cathedral of Our Lady of Angels with the 5 freeway that cuts through and frames those two backsided surfaces. But I started to rethink what sort of big buildings one might look at and the urban spaces that are then produced around them. And that brings me to the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, which is the largest jail in the world. nearby is the Urbanism Piper Technical Center, which houses the Los Angeles Police Air Division, which is also the largest rooftop heliport in the world. And then also a block of bail bond services buildings that support the other two institutions, these big buildings that are creating new surfaces or not new surfaces, but are creating surfaces in LA that I'm looking at. And so if you go on the ground, you can start to pick up on some of the textures, some of the strange aesthetics that take place in these backgrounded areas, looking at the backsides of, in these videos, it's specifically the backsides of the bail bond buildings. And so if this is the satellite map of the area that I'm looking at, then this is also the area. And these are mills of just portions of these surfaces and these back faces that really fascinate me, and are the sites of where I'm looking to establish a pattern to change some of the outcomes in these areas. And so to go back to the satellite map, what I want to do is produce a thickened edge of this dance institution. But rather than just a simple dash that occurs on the backsides of these faces, it's something that's more of a line with dashes attached to it that are sites of material change, activity change, that then weave across streets, frame the back ends of these buildings. And occasionally a dash will get much larger and occupy some of the blank spaces in order to provide some anchor points that then support this thinner network of infrastructure that leaches out from them. And so to zoom in on one of these lines, it would look something like this, where the large black space is the backside, the back parking lots of the bail bond services buildings. And so if you were to further develop that site, they'd be framed by the walls of the existing buildings, and then something like an open air performance space and a garden would then come off of that, with maybe lockers for people to come in and store their things while they go back out into this network and perform or practice or even shower in facilities that are much more like what you would find on the beach, of these lightweight infrastructural notes that then provide a change to the way that these spaces are used and perceived. So to return to these surfaces, the material change can be something as small as redrawing or re-editing these surfaces with that dashed line, and then bringing in another layer of agave or a cabbage or vegetation that acts as screens for you to take a shower behind, or to temper these surfaces in a different way. And then just another example of this idea playing out. And that is where I am with Midterm.
So can I ask?
Yeah,
Robert,
please.
thank you for the presentation. So are you thinking of keeping the current uses on those warehouses, or are they going to change completely?
The idea is that the uses would still stay the same. It's not like these buildings are being knocked down, but it's a backgrounded network that then, when people coming in to use a bail bond services, they'll also be in the presence of this pattern that will change, or hopefully would change, some of the outcomes of families or whoever else might be entering these spaces.
I was wondering, because I really like the aerial image that you showed. Maybe, and I love that, and also the map with the white lines that reminded me of Nolly maps. So with those two things. What I thought is that maybe you could do this in 3D and maybe start using these kind of lines, but over the buildings. I don't know if that's possible depending on the structure, but maybe that could make all this system more interesting, like climbing on top of the buildings, since they look as it's possible. I don't know if you could consider that.
I haven't dealt too much with physically climbing on the buildings themselves. I do think that some three-dimensionality to these lines is an important one. But in my mind, it's something that occurs in a very, very thin application of a material change. So rather than building out like a system to climb upon, it's something that when you walk past it, it changes your perception of that space that you're passing through. And so concrete becomes something else with that same geometry, the same sort of like base visual language that's there.
Yeah, I was thinking of something like very light, like staircase, and maybe like put some green on top of the rooftops. Maybe something for you to consider. It's because it's like very very gray and pure concrete, the area. So maybe yeah, it shocked me really. So maybe something to comment.
Thank you.
Am I mistaken, or you haven't quite gone inside the buildings, really?
Yeah, there's not really an inside to any building. It's the closest thing that you get to the inside is when you have three walls of the backsides of three bail bond buildings that then frame a space for like a dance stage to be put into. Something that I've been working with is like casting. So early on, I was working with dirt and wax models, like these kind of heavy bases that then thicken the ground and elevate a platform for maybe like a more formal dance recital to occur on.
Right. So are you actually proposing a change of use for the interiors? Or is this more like kind of working on top of and alongside of the existing sites?
Yeah, on top of and alongside of is the more accurate representation.
So yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to gauge like the tone is clear, right? It's like a kind of playful critique of these existing spaces and how they're situated and what they represent. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what level that you're trying to address them. So it's not, for example, you know, with what did you say? It was like North America's largest jail or the world's largest jail. It's not calling for its demolition necessarily, but it is proposing a kind of more, let's say, therapeutic alternative to what's happening on the inside. Would that be accurate?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Because I feel like, I mean, especially with prisons right now, I just feel like you have to be very precise with the way that you're articulating that relationship, because, I mean, you've chosen a really interesting problem and an interesting solution as well, but you wouldn't want to, I feel like there's been a shift in what you might say is we can ask for, right? And I say we in very vague terms, but you wouldn't want your project, you want to make sure that the project has the critical element that it intends to have, and not a kind of that it doesn't justify or apologize for the prison.
Oh no, and yeah, that's absolutely not its intention at all.
I think, for instance, this came up. I'll just, as an example, I was looking at a project where someone was proposing to do, what is called historic preservation work around Chicano struggle in Los Angeles. And the site of the old Lincoln Heights jail came up. And the question was, like, to what extent do you try to preserve this site or just demolish it, right? Just like demolish it and replace it with a park that actually celebrates something that you can believe in. And I think the politics of what we preserve and what we demolish and what we choose to look at is constantly changing, especially now. And that you might want to just have a well-formed position on that when it comes to the final.
Yeah, I think the idea is that these spaces are intended to create tension and attention about the existing big buildings and the consequences that their presence in the city produces. And it's not something that's like saying like, okay, we'll go out right away and the solution is to demolish the jails and turn it into a giant park. I think that kind of misses a conversation point and creating that tension. Like, it has to be there in order for these things to come up very close against them.
The other thing I was thinking of, and I'll stop after this, but the other thing I was thinking of is that there's an interesting kind of lateral connection to demilitarization. And I'm kind of like, the more I see, there's been a lot in the news about how, local police forces now have access to like highly militarized equipment. And obviously our public spaces have been revealed yet again to be even more militarized than maybe we were paying attention to. But I'm constantly, I haven't really followed up on this, but I'm constantly reminded of the fact that like Lamborghini started after World War II as a company that was converting military equipment into farm equipment, right? They were turning tanks into tractors. And I feel like there's like a really big opportunity in design to revisit that idea, to demilitarize spaces and to turn them into more productive spaces. And it seems like your project is kind of pointing in that direction. And I just wonder if there's maybe even a more systematic way of approaching that question of like, taking whole categories of designed objects or designed spaces and converting them to other uses. But I like the direction it's going.
I can be quick. Coming from an historian's perspective, I wonder how you're going to develop this notion of performance within that space, which seems to be integral. Whether you are imagining a kind of choreography that is designed in response to the specific site that each space is located just adjacent to or made a part of, or if you're thinking about the choreography in terms of the public. And so the choreography is something that can be spontaneous or shaped by how it is exactly that you designed the stage, the garden, and different components. And so maybe as you develop your ideas in the final presentation, you can make that a bit more clear in terms of how you're presenting it.
Rob, I've always been impressed by the fact that you are working on an urban project, but you're working through very precise material tectonics and techniques, maybe in a similar way as Sam is working on a kind of very large scale site, but really thinking architecturally about methods. And so I'm so glad that you showed these amazing photographs of your models. And I don't know if I missed it, but you have these dirt carpets as well as all of them. I think that it's all kind of in construction, let's say, or in the process of being assembled. And my sense is from the conversation today is, this is a really great moment to just keep going with the development of this as a very peculiar building, as something that doesn't necessarily have an interior, but has an architectural attention to detail. And to kind of completely continue to develop the models as you have been doing. It's a really powerful kind of mode of presenting.
Yeah, can I maybe just add to that? I know we're running out of time. I do really love the models, and I love that attention to the kind of like texture of this site, let's say, that you've picked. And I also think your approach of almost creating a kind of like cultural parasite to otherwise very disturbing buildings and program in general. So I think it's really interesting, and I'm curious to see how you would develop this further, and how you could exaggerate this kind of parasitic relationship further. I think both at a tectonic level, but also at a programmatic level. What happens when these two institutions clash programmatically? A kind of dense institution, cultural institution, and prison and all that. And I think that that's and the kind of general vibe of the neighborhood, let's say, how does that clash with what you're proposing and how you're attaching to it? I think is both programmatic and tectonic, and I think it's exciting to see how you might develop that.
Thank you.
Hey Rob, did you talk to Mimi and Marcella?
I'm gonna send them the presentation that I just did. I wanted to get all that together before I moved on with them.
SCI-Arc is helping set up a public dance interventions with the LA Dance Project with Benjamin Millepied, the former head of dance at the Paris Opera Ballet and the husband of Natalie Portman. And so I've asked Rob if he'll help out with the logistics on that project, because it seemed like a match made in heaven.
Yeah, I'd love to.
That's really great. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you all. Very helpful.
Okay, Luke. Hi.
Hi, everybody. Okay. My thesis is titled Unoccupied. I started everything with the study of void, particularly the subtraction of the expected and the hold on. Sorry. The subtraction of the expected and the moment that leaves us asking questions. In looking into the etymology of the term, I stumbled upon the concept of the riderless horse, or the empty saddle, which led me to some of the initial studies you see here. We'll come back to these in a minute. In a moment of stark polarization in both American politics and culture, we still share something in common. 640 million acres of public lands held in trust by the federal government for, quote, all citizens of the United States. As someone who grew up in the American West and spent much of my life exploring these places, I've come to recognize them as strongholds against climate change, sacred to Native peoples, home to extensive wildlife, and intrinsic to our national identity. This thesis is, for lack of any other term, a road trip, a way in which to explore the role of the architect in this landscape of public land management. You can see Rainer Banham from his book, The American Deserta, which was kind of his ode to the American West. 4 sites have been identified, each managed by a different government entity, which has required that I engage in conversation with each, understanding their function, their accessibility, permitting, and stances toward young grad students making odd requests. This project is, you can see here are some of the correspondences that I've had with the U.S. Forest Service in terms of, discussing the idea of building on site. The project is as much about documentation as it is design. I built a website that will go live this weekend when I start my road trip on Saturday, and will in real time document my trip as I build a series of temporary monuments. What you can see here are also some of the early documentations that I did for, at the beginning of the summer, including some videos here of sites that I will be later visiting. Okay. Back to horses. Horses are our thesis group's motto, more horses. Each structure is a simple combination of plywood, 4x4 pressure treated posts, and paint. Stark white against the natural landscape requires that the onlookers take a second view. The gaps in the forms incite a degree of personal investigation, creating a sense of the face and the whole phenomenon. Each monument is both temporary and anonymous. They're not intended to memorialize a moment, but instead be filled in by people. So these are my 4 sites. Pawnee National Grassland, which is a Forest Service site. Routt County, which has a Bureau of Land Management agency overseeing it. The Ruby Mountains, which has a number of USDA Forest Service sites. And then finally, Racetrack Playa, which is up in Death Valley, which is National Park Service. You can see here, which is my first scale model of one of these monuments, I guess you could say, on site here in Skaneateles, New York. And I certainly have a lot to learn about building them, but the idea is that I would construct one of these on each individual site and document the construction. That's that.
Luke, can you speak a little bit more about the role of the website and then also the role of this, I guess you called it a temporary monument, and how people are meant to kind of go between these 2 interfaces?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, the monuments themselves are really just a way to, and I don't, we struggle with calling them monuments or whether they're an installation or what be it, but the idea that they are anonymous, they don't represent anything in particular other than a degree of engagement by American people or by peoples. I think that you have to, you know, in a moment where we are, our federal lands, which are incredibly sacred and important to so many different people, if we don't take a stance in kind of overseeing that and have a degree of ownership over how they exist, there's a huge potential by this administration and other entities to kind of take control of those. The idea of the website is to just kind of document how I've interacted with these different agencies and understanding how they function and how the different sites are connected themselves through all under one, kind of federal umbrella, even though they're all their own separate entity. So.
Look, this may not be necessarily helpful to this particular conversation, but I just uploaded, I don't know, pasted, I guess, on the chat, the Roy Lichtenstein's house. And it has very different kind of politics, maybe none, but I think as a kind of representational exercise could be an interesting reference. I was wondering how 3-dimensional these stencils could be and start to think about, okay, whether they are literally like billboards in the state parks. And I'm not talking about the kind of politics that you're mentioning. I'm just thinking about how they could take shape and what kind of form and how they could look like. And so to what extent are they 3-dimensional? Do they produce a kind of optical effect of 3-dimensionality? Can they be folded? How can they be folded? What are the kind of repercussions of even having seams on these billboards, I wonder. But I think there's something really interesting in how you're taking these photographs of these like very flat things in very vast green spaces, parks, etc., and what we see through the stencil, I think, is already like really fascinating, and how you curate what these stencils frame is really interesting. But I think another thing that could be interesting as you film is how do we move around them, and what do we see when we're moving around them, and how do they change our perception of these sites that you're intervening in. So I invite you to maybe think of these monuments, interventions, sculptures, whatever you want to call them, as three-dimensional, but not in a traditional sense, meaning they would not actually be volumetric, but maybe they can form volume through folding and seaming. And maybe by actually treating them as a kind of 360 entity, we can have multiple views and multiple, maybe even political views towards the site. So maybe just take a look and see if you might find these interesting.
Great, thank you. In response to that, I think there is a degree of three-dimensionality to them, right? To them as they are. I can kind of reshare my screen, but it's very subtle in that the cutouts do pull off from the face itself, and kind of create that, like, you know, face in a whole pumpkin patch kind of thing, where you have to step into it to be inside the silhouette.
I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is so there's volumetric and there's implied volumetric or implied three-dimensional, and I think maybe if you're layering, but if you start to work with multiple facets and sides, maybe that could again, like, multiply the views and the possible, like, framed views that you're interested in.
Great, thank you.
I would think about also, sorry, one other thing, because red is very prominent in the aesthetics of your presentation, and it has a kind of desaturation aesthetic. So you're sort of in between sepia and desaturation. But I don't know, I would think about color more radically. I mean, what can you take from the site and bring into these monuments or these sculptures? Not in a kind of camouflage sense. You're not trying to make these disappear, but maybe part of them can be treated with the same kind of color palette of the site, or your own interpretation of the color palette of your site, almost like colors and numbers that could start to actually index how you're documenting the sites that you're picking. Because red seems too foreign right now to the sites that you're working with, and I'm not quite sure yet, like, what's the meaning of red and whether there is a meaning. Maybe it doesn't matter, but maybe you could design the color palettes more specifically in the kind of application and the applique of the colors on your stencils, etc., could become more extracted from the site.
I would want to hear a little bit more about why you chose those 4 specific sites, and, you know, maybe like more of a sense of if you're thinking about the views from like a 360 point of view, if they're like specific vistas that you would be activating, as well as if one of the ways in which you're thinking about the monument and land has to do with ownership, the history of this site, and including sort of battles over potential legal ownership, or the histories in terms of how it was either taken or transferred from indigenous groups to the US government. And when you said that the website in part records your engagement with different agencies, I was wondering, is he talking about federal agencies, state agencies, the Department of the Interior, and getting into the legal matter of how that site is understood is, I think, sort of like interesting and significant to how I'm thinking about those sites, particularly if the notion of ownership is something that you are thinking about. And also to perhaps have that inform the way in which the physical form of the thing that you're putting out into the land exists. Because I think that you want to avoid the kind of recolonization of that area through the material form that you're inserting. And so like thinking about the relationship between that material form to the land that existed in, the relationship to the visitor or the person engaging with that form and what relationship that person has to the land, I think are also not insignificant in terms of understand like how you're making meaning of the whole interaction and the whole sort of experience of your work.
That's great insight. Thank you.
Kavior, how would you recommend highlighting, I guess, all of the agencies and all of the peoples and in the project, and how would Luke begin to kind of present or represent that discourse and all parties?
Well, I think that like maybe number one, instead of thinking about things totally on an abstract level, get into the specificity of a site and understand the history and all the different actors involved and the relationships between the different entities in the past and in the present. And then you can use that as material to form, right? And so like you think about the form that you're putting out into the landscape as something that reveals all of these different aspects. There's not this like cutout that you're putting into the land that is maybe like not so different from what you would find in an amusement park, right? Like a very sort of quick superficial look at these images, that's what I think of. But obviously you have many other questions that go sort of deeper into understanding each part of what you're putting together, including the land. And so just really digging into the specificity, I think, is one way out to kind of better to sharpen what it is that you want to say, like what are the specific material histories that you're engaging and the point that you're making in terms of creating this form and presenting in a specific space.
I think so much of what I've been thinking about has been trying to bring a degree of seeing I don't know how to say it. I think my tentativeness into going into the specificity is that you get caught up in, like, they're all stolen lands, right? And we recognize that. And then, but I guess the argument is more to the degree that we need to all protect them as a greater whole. And I really appreciate, and I think I will definitely, follow through with identifying the greater history of each site. But, to answer your earlier question of, is there any kind of specificity to each site? There was, and it was really just about, making sure that I hit each one of the 4 major land management agencies that we kind of get to engage with. So, but I think I really appreciate that. And I think I'll definitely dig in further.
Thank you, Luke. We have to move on.
We should move on. Zeina, sorry, one more thing. Just Luke, I think maybe one of those could be a reservation.
Mm-hmm.
Just to produce a little bit more of a inclusive sense. And I mean, I know that there are federal lands, but there's a kind of pre-federal, I guess, landscape as well. And I have a feeling that as you become specific, let's say about one site, very specific, and you go there and you build this, maybe the other 4 are specifically researched, but you don't have to build all 5 monuments. You maybe build one up and the other 4 could be renderings or proposals. So in a way, in terms of like what's plausible for 1 month of work, you may want to research and kind of set up things on the website as projects, but maybe one of them kind of completed as something that we can actually engage with physically.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, then I'm gonna take over. Do you hear me, everybody?
Hey, Kistoffer, perfect.
Hey, good. Yeah, so my name is Kistoffer. I'm just gonna share my screen. Just a second. All right, you guys see this? Do you see this?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so the title of my thesis is called Table of Content. And I'm using the idea of the table as a means of thinking about selection, inclusion, collection, and accumulation of differences. Really to start things off, I'm just going to read this a short paragraph. The thesis table of content examines an architecture that is promiscuous in its abilities to include. The table, located in between those who have it in common, it serves as the thing that both relates and separates people at the same time. To bring something to the table is to make a contribution or an offer to the discussion. But in order to bring something to the table, it requires the table to always already be there. This thesis explores the table as a building typology in order to discuss the current state of public buildings and how we engage with them as infrastructural monuments, and at the same time examining the relationship between the exterior public space and the proposal for an interior one. The table is an interpersonal and spatial exchange, a physical manifestation of a negotiating space. It is a generator for discussion with the inclusion and participation of its citizens. It is a space for assembly and alternative intermingling. The table is a destination and a building of public ownership. So through my thesis prep, I was looking into the two definitions of table and tabulate that both come from the Latin word tabula, but manifested in very two different ways. One is the geometrical one that we know from the physical version of it, a flat top, a tabletop with one or more legs. The other one, a sort of tabulate system that brings things into relation. And just a brief overlook of the research, I was looking into art pieces, both looking into art and architecture, understanding the two-dimensional and three-dimensional aspect of the presence of the tabula, and two projects that I've kind of highlighted a bit, the Giorgio Mirandi work process of collecting bottles and vases onto the table to create this kind of new scene from which a new sort of definition in the relationship can be made. Also, the distinction between scale has jumped in his portraits. The bottles almost look like buildings and vice versa. And the Henry Labrousse, the externalization of the content of the building with the content of each of the titles of the books on the stacks on the inside of the building, creating this like physical presence in the public. And so the site that I'm taking on is Pershing Square in downtown LA that has had a history, a very complicated history to its citizens. And arguably it can be named that the plaza hasn't really landed on any kind of like successful term. Maybe mostly in its original sense, it was more like a lush area with tons of deep-rooted trees. But once the densification and the commercialization of the downtown LA happened, the need for parking also, as well as a growing concern for criminals and drug addicts and everybody gathering in the plaza. There was a sense of non-visuality that created a tension in the public. So after the car park structure was created, it was actually entirely fenced off and was just positioned with a ton of grass. But even though right now there are proposals for a new kind of park, they don't want to include benches, like a lot of benching, because the benches create a place for a destination, and I think the city would much rather have this place as something you just pass through, and not as much as something you kind of seek towards in a way. And so I started by doing this like diagram that kind of position or broadens the spectrum of let's say architecture in general, between the federate and the corporate, which is talking about management, between private and access. And I really wanted to position the project as to the highly public and towards the federate, which also in a sense is the dealing with the public. And in the research, I was also studying a lot of the terms that Sarah Ahmed was questioning in terms of the experiences of Edmund Husserl. And just to give a quick quote, perception is a way of facing something. I can perceive an object only insofar as the orientation allows me to see it. And in seeing it in this way or that way, it becomes an it, which means I have already taken an orientation toward it. Basically saying that you have to place something in order for something to be perceivable. Looking at the Nolly map, just as a reference for the mass versus void, the exterior versus interior, and the public versus private, and the breaking of that notion. So I started by doing some figure ground models, basically seeking to find sort of discussing terms of like how to elevate a surface and creating kind of monumental presence. So it's kind of multifaceted as a result of not a strategic planning, but a form of inclusivity and collection. This is basically a technique of kind of casting multiple shapes into one form, studying as well the different kinds of layerings of techniques, understanding the relationship between figure and ground, and kind of portraying holes into it as well. Yeah, this is a growing collection. Also like miniature tables that I was doing for the miniature review, as well as talking about like some kind of geometrical form with an elevated plinth. So this is the site. Here you see all the public parks in the neighborhood, which is very limited in a way. And so the way I'm thinking about the project is that this is the plot of the existing Pershing Square, and trying to like kind of scatter moments of like urban sort of densification onto the site, creating sort of different moments onto the surface. And the federate, the second level, being like almost also as the preoccupation of space, but in a different scale. And the last one is the interior table, which I'm kind of working on. I think this will make more sense if I'm. This is like a rough volumetrics of how I'm imagining this interior public space. So on an urban level, it's kind of disfiguring the rigidity of the site, becoming a kind of figure. But the idea of the building is to be like, this is the existing level of the park, and then take you up to an elevated public space. In this space, you have these like new kind of interior landscapes that allows for a different kind of public assembly, kind of sheltered from the surroundings. And a facade that I've been working on, trying to get some of the techniques from the stone, the cast stone, into like a more digitalized way, trying to work in between the two, thinking about the interior space as like a shaded space, as well as the kind of like the light set the scene. So rather than the plaza acting on the scale of the city, the interior plaza is acting on the scale of the room, where sort of the body and the space is kind of like more manageable, and there's a series of arena that allows for public gatherings and negotiations to take on in this interior table space. And this is like a collection of models that I've done so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christoph. Beautiful models. Can you speak a little bit more to the facade studies? It kind of came out of nowhere, and I'm just curious, like, what's your thought process there?
So I was thinking about like the texture of the physical models. I was using different kind of foams to create this kind of porosity to break down the monumentality. And I was thinking about a facade that was layered in a kind of similar way, sort of randomizing the pattern a bit. That was like the.
I apologize. I'm kind of like zooming in here. I let our guests talk about the bigger picture, but it feels. I mean, it has a kind of almost like a computational complexity that is anti what you've been working on to some extent, or at least the aesthetic that you've been kind of adopting in your formal studies. And I wonder, while I love the early attempts of taking photos of the shadows and the kind of like light through them, I think it has a great potential. I wonder if maybe starting to actually take the photos of the facades of your models more seriously and sort of maybe scan them or trace them or whatnot to start to study this kind of like flickering and painterly effect of the facade might be more productive than trying to recreate these effects in a kind of computational space. I don't know. I mean, there could be many ways to take this, but rather than to, you get the idea. Like essentially, rather than to randomize it through a computational algorithm, and
but
give it a fake geometry, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I totally get your point. But I like to be in the span in between as a like exploration. That's why I kind of like rationalize.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I think like I said, the models are beautiful, and I'm excited to see them developed as convincing buildings. And so, of course, at a certain point, you have to take very seriously questions of assembly, tectonics, scale and sizes of materials that you'll use to sort of develop these massing models. Definitely. So to some extent, there will be repetition. There will be small kind of thicknesses and small bricks and materials that you need to assemble this thing. But I'm not necessarily sure that generating the facade study through kind of algorithmic process makes sense. I think you might be able to merge these two in a more beautiful way. But look more closely at these models. And I think there will be an embedded grid and a kind of orthogonal system for sure, but in some repetition, but maybe it's not by way of the repetition of one single unit.
Christoph, yeah, I think it was a really interesting site that you chose. I mean, Pershing Square, it's like extremely unsatisfying public space, which is maybe a perfect metaphor for Los Angeles's relationship to public space. This kind of constantly failed project to represent what civic space could be. But then it's funny because in your proposal, which begins, I think, with very abstract elements and a kind of fundamental idea of the table as the basis for politics, even though it starts off in a very abstract way, I think what it almost reconstructs is a welfare state notion of cultural space that was actually quite popular in Scandinavia. And there was a book that, based on a PhD that came out about 6 years ago called People's Palaces, Architecture, Culture, and Democracy in Post-War Western Europe, which is primarily about the Kulturhuset in Stockholm. And it tracks this like very short period of time in which European states were willing to spend large amounts of money on what were essentially democratic infrastructure, like public spaces that had substantial resources, like libraries and meeting spaces and concert halls and large public areas in front of them, like these large scale public projects, which I think is fascinating. And the only time I went to Stockholm, that was the one thing that I was struck by the most was the Kulturhuset. And the idea that Los Angeles could have something like that in Pershing Square is almost utopian, right? I mean, it's a great proposal, but I think the reason I referenced that book by Christoph Graf is that it also articulates the incredibly fragile political consensus that kind of architecture required, and what the kind of democratic politics that it relied on to be built. But I think it's a timely proposal, right?
Tim, what is the word that you're saying? I can't hear.
It's just culture house in Swedish, and I have a terrible Swedish accent. Yeah.
Kulturhaus. Is it? Yeah. Can you type it in at some point?
Kulturhuset. I'll send the.
Kulturhuset. Okay, I couldn't. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. This. Great point.
Yeah. I get the references.
It's a really great point because Christopher, when you show the renderings and all of a sudden this table is sitting on a white kind of blanket, it feels like a bit of a letdown. You don't want to just fully erase the existing park, but to kind of bring back this urban life. And I know that you're working on it, so it's very hard to depict something like that in just like a Rhino render. But that initial site and the site plan of the ground level is probably going to be extremely important. So, Kulturhuset.
I guess one question that I have is what new kinds of social engagement that form will allow for, and if that's important to you, or if it's something to be looked at and is sort of like a visual intervention to the landscape, or if there's something about the way in which that space facilitates a certain kind of way to move around it or ways of engagement with one another that is significant. And then if so, it would be, I think, important to show that through sort of details or sort of from like a particular person's point of view, because that wasn't very clear to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's ultimately where I want to be at that level. So you won't have to question at least what I think I can do, whether it works or not. I mean, all these things are very like speculative in a way, like talking about building as public usage, because that's ultimately for time to unroll the success or the not success. So yeah, that's a really good point.
And also just someone who has been to Pershing Square, and also the way that sometimes I've used it, which is not to walk around and enjoy the trees that are not doing so well. But there's a massive parking lot underneath, which a lot of people in the surrounding buildings use. And I don't know if that might be an interesting space to activate and to engage in some ways. And also thinking about like different types of accessibility, different types of users, as well as creating and designing structures or pathways that might make people engage one another who typically, in the way that that space is used now, wouldn't, right? Like the car drivers or the people who work there, and other people who tend to use the space on top for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kavior. I think these are really great points, Kistoffer. So in a way, to kind of address the urban and the material, as Zeina has discussed, is something that the Centre Pompidou Plaza is also amazing, so that you can really challenge that kind of, that section in relationship to the parking garage that Kavior mentions. All of these things have to do with the kind of section through the city and a way to represent, I guess, the masses, and kind of how do you even show that kind of density, the density. So I've been like, just, you know, full disclosure, I've been trying to ask Kistoffer to work on a very large model, like a physical model, but it's to be TBD, I think. From his point of view, it's a little bit tough to kind of put so much effort into things like that when we're on Zoom. Nonetheless, like seeing the presentation today, I think that the physical models have all just kind of blown everybody away across the board. It's not just Kistoffer, but also Sam and Wendy and Rob, like everybody who's been working at this kind of material scale. So this is just my own bias, you know, Zoom or not Zoom, like the physical model is where the craft and technique in many of your projects really is at the heart of the process. But, you know, to TBD, and of course it's up to each one of you to figure out how to do this moving forward. We have 2 more students, so we might finish like 10 minutes late. I hope that Tim and Kavior and Eric, you may be able to stick around. If not, of course, we understand. We're kind of on time.
Yeah, I think we'll be okay, I hope.
10 minutes.
If Vincent and Amanda have a... anyway, so Vincent, you're ready?
Thank you so much, by the way. Yeah, that was...
Thank you.
Beautiful project, Krista. So Vincent, you asked me to pin you. Should I do it now or?
Yeah, sure.
You need to spotlight him.
I'm seeing those. Okay, let's see if it works. Am I spotlighted or no? Oh, spotlighting, it just makes my screen bigger. We can do it later. It's just testing the format I'm thinking of. If you click the 3 dots, and then you should be able to like spotlight video.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Let me just go. Can you see that?
We lost you.
Oh, you can't see it. Okay. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So hi everyone. My name is Vincent, and my title of my project is Walk This Way, and I'm designing a community center in Rosemead, California. My work is also on my website. If you go to Architecture's Thesis, it has images of the work. I'm still kind of loading the text, but if you want to look closely at the work. So I'm going to talk to you through the site, technique, design, and then looking at my final review, the final format I'm considering. So yeah, I'm designing a community center in the city of Rosemead. The site is set for redevelopment by the city in 2020. Currently, it's a large parking lot around along Garvey Avenue. I came into this project researching community centers and histories of community centers. And so when I was looking at a site for my project, I came across, through my research, the city was asking for redevelopment of their land. And I thought that it was a great opportunity for me to kind of interrogate the suburban community as a starting point. So yeah, these are the lists of sites that the city is looking at. I'm designing, I chose this one in particular, this large parking lot. As you can see, it's surrounded by houses. And then up here is the current, not community center, but it's a park that has a pool and a splash zone. It's important to recognize the land I'm working on. As an outsider to LA and Canadian, it's also, you know, a site that has been stolen land from the Kotch indigenous people, a history that Rosemead, the city itself on the website, doesn't recognize. The relationship to the land, I think, was important to kind of address what it means to like build on top of now a pavement site. So this is the city, their brief and their strategic plan. Their action items were quite generic, like dog park, more park space, and youth programs, as well as the expansion of splash zone, which I was looking at in my thesis prep, the histories of community pools. So having the city kind of want, like, we want to include more like, you know, recreation, athletic recreation areas. I was like, oh, that's a really cool kind of merging of minds. So this was kind of, I think, talking through how I'm approaching it, which is, you know, the community center is a series of relationships that cannot be contained by a building or program. These are images of kind of the current Rosemead civic spaces. I think I'm arguing for the fact that the community is a collection of parts that come together and share a common ground. So things that are large things in relation to human body, like pools, parking, and library. Medium things like fencing, bus shelters, lighting, shading devices, and then small things like storage lockers, swings, and garbage disposal. Maybe begin to interrogate the possibilities of communal care. In terms of technique, I've been working through layering, printing, and scanning as a starting point. The content of these drawings have been often like annotating bodies in maybe in water or programs of interest, layering both as like a digital layering through like the computer, but also kind of analog layering of this is crayon on the pedestal here. It's a solid pedestal. I didn't make it, but the texture was it's like a result of like crayon on MDF. These are zoom in of my studies of drawing of synchronized swimming, and then like drawing the site, printing, and stopping the technique of maybe controlling the ink coming from the printer. So when I'm looking at scanning, I'm also looking at the edges, so the seams of the ways that things come together. So I bought these really these scissors that I would kind of interrogate like how trimming and scanning could produce maybe ways of stitching things together. Another drawing, and then eventually kind of coming to addressing layering of a roof system on a ground. So this was my miniature model of possibly designing a roof structure that acts as a shelter for the farmers market. This is zoom in details of the layering. And then like thinking about the pool, drawing the pool that I go to, the YMCA nearby. And then arriving at maybe, I think, a more diagrammatic approach to the site itself, kind of blocking out the spaces and the programs that I'm looking at. So the parking, the roof, the library, the splash zone, the pool, and the playground. However, I think when I arrived at this, I kind of realized I'm approaching it in a kind of problematic territory of kind of just like overlaying everything as if it's neutral, and I didn't want that. So I'm kind of now investigating ways of bringing all the techniques I've had and incorporating it back onto the site as a drawing. Right now I have like the large building elements, but I'm working towards designing like the medium and small things. These are close-up images of these layers of techniques of drawing a site plan. So the issues I want to work on for the final would be bring the techniques into a populated model and using it as a stage set to reveal moments of consideration on the site. This project, I want to address, is not about developing a better community. It is thinking about how public spaces redesign could begin to inform how we consider issues of like habits and bring conversation of comfort into building identity and community. So these are the topics I'm considering, maybe a little bit more of a small scale approach. And I'm still struggling with maybe looking at ways to represent it. However, I'm currently looking at spending my next few weeks designing a large model. Let me see if this works. So this is my kitchen table right now. I don't know if you can see, and I'm thinking of actually building a working model where there's a plan view of just orienting the viewer to the site. And then I have a camera where I could actually show moments of the ways the buildings relate to the ground that it sits upon. So that's kind of a test of what I want to work on towards the final. I don't know if you can see. That's it. I can leave it there.
Vincent, you probably are not gonna like this, but it does feel, the last image you showed us, the camera view, the site plan almost feels like a kind of like master planning board game that the community literally could sort of help design. Mm-hmm. And I'm not advocating for this in any way because I don't necessarily believe in any kind of like community design, but or any kind of informal design. But there's something kind of interesting about the layers and maybe the order of the layers, like what comes first, what comes next, in relation to also your website where we can actually move things around and layer things. And what is the extent of this in your project, and what's the role of the kind of literal layering and moving around of objects in how you design things? And I felt like the technical plan, the orthographic plan was kind of didn't do your ideas of layering justice. It felt much more static and kind of final and rigid. And so I wonder what parts of the project can have a more dynamic aspect to them that is maybe movable or replaceable or more reconfigurable, perhaps. I don't know, it's something to think about, but definitely the site model is beautiful, and the aesthetic of moving things around and drawing on them and sort of layering them should to some extent come through in how you plan that community. So yeah.
That's really helpful for me. Like right now, totally the ground site plan is just printed on paper. One pattern is the same hierarchy as the next because it's just ink, right? One layer of ink. And I think like the more I figure out how to divide the layers up, then I could probably model it as like physical layers on top of each other that could move around or be replaced. I just thought of like also in my head, like, yeah, no, keep going.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're talking about this at a material level, and I wonder if you could maybe think of it as different scales. So right now we have the scale of the kind of the landscape, the sort of the planning of the ground, and then there's the scale of the buildings themselves and their skin and all that, and maybe there is another scale, a scale of furniture, maybe whether it's urban furniture or furniture in the buildings themselves. I don't know, and maybe those could be more dynamic to some extent in how you plan this model.
Yeah. Thinking of like when like moving of shading systems or even barriers of entry, like when the pool is drained in the winter, like there probably will be another like movement of objects around the site so that like it would kind of fence off certain areas of the site when it's not in use.
Yeah,
I think my
also
internet.
it could be purely programmatic as well, that
Okay.
you consider the cyclical nature of these centers, the seasonality of them, even their diurnal effects, like morning versus night, winter versus summer. And that's at a very different level than, let's say, the actual aesthetic approach of the kind of dynamic pieces. But at the level of the program, I do think that it cannot be rigid in that sense. You need to consider more flexible kind of spaces and how they can be used in different ways as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I'm just writing it down.
I guess I have some similar thoughts come to mind as the ones I was thinking of in relationship to Kistoffer's project, which is like, what is a community center for you? Who are you sort of including in this notion of community? And is one thing that you're trying to do is to make it more usable year round? Are you trying to make it more inclusive? Are you trying to make it more accessible, right? In whatever way you want to think about that, whether it's in terms of historical racial discrimination, ability, or like ableism. And you mentioned, right, the sort of history of colonialization, and that you were thinking about the site in terms of how it was indigenous land, but what are you going to do with that history now that you know it? And if it's something that you do want to acknowledge. So just some more sort of engagement with the social historical aspects of the site, its users, would be helpful to sort of see the full kind of ramifications of the community center that you're envisioning.
Totally, I totally, yeah, I think the, in a very preliminary level, it was like, it should be pretty flat given the site itself. It should be, it should give shade as a way of like giving comfort to the community in the desert. In terms of like the land acknowledgement, and then turning that into a part of my thesis, I haven't considered that. And that's something I will consider.
I mean, even something so like simple and explicit as taking a structure that was once found in that land, right, by the indigenous group that you mentioned, or I think the Tongva people are also probably there at some point, and integrating those architectural structures into the site and the kind of complex that you're building would be sort of immediately sort of would make giving that presence, like visible and physical presence, would be a kind of statement. I mean, that's like a very simplistic sort of way of going about it, but yeah. But anyways, the land acknowledgement you did seem to be significant to you, and I would be sort of interested in you sort of engaging that further.
Thank you.
we're at time. If there are any other comments for Vincent, please jump in. But I just wanted to also mention, Vincent, that that new site plan and its relationship to the interface of the website, where all these mobile images and cutouts can kind of come in and out, exactly as Zeina has mentioned. It's amazing. It's kind of like, it's almost like the opposite of an idea of a master plan where like there's one master. It's like a community plan. And so that, she's right, like maybe you don't need every single person kind of moving it around for you, but just the fact that it has this feeling of, a kind of overlay, and that the shapes all have like edges and patterns. There's something really, really powerful about kind of the different scales of overlay of these shapes and buildings and patterns and pop objects versus populations. And I think that, kind of we are all like really bringing those in relationship to kind of Kavior's point of like the site, and thinking about how everybody can actually begin to understand what you're doing and like produce and visualize or make legible the kinds of accessibility interests and kind of points that you bring up. That's the required link, right? Like where it's where some of these methods you're able to kind of speak directly to their value, to like the good value of something that you're producing. So that, because right now I think this, and this is more a general comment, there's a lot of force and interest in producing like good buildings that actually bring something to the community that is very special and that kind of emboldens it and plays a big role in public space. And that we can hear through all of your presentations through the language with which you're presenting. And then there's that other side of like the expertise of an architect and thinking kind of technically and formally. And I think what this next month will be is like to kind of begin to interlace the kind of the political personal values into the formal projects. I think for many of you that's already present, but to kind of be explicit about it. How do we do that as architects? It's more like a question mark. It's not something that we can resolve in one morning's conversation.
No, I agree with, it's something that I've been having difficulty expressing as well.
Thanks, Vincent. I think that was beautiful and really beautifully formatted as a kind of initial thought of how to get us out of this like Zoom window and really see a different perspective. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, Eric's baby girl. She's very cute.
Amanda, you ready? I think Amanda's next.
Yeah, hi, I'm last.
Awesome. Take it away.
It's our last presentation for today.
Okay. Hey, everyone. So I'm working on the project of the Home Office and taking a close look at the program of the Home Office. The site of this investigation is my parents' garage. And through the documentation of the garage, this site becomes a space of research and also a theatrical stage set for the performance of the thesis at work. The garage here becomes both the space of design and a space of comfort. So here is my miniature model. I'm interested in what it means to define one space at this time and how one makes sense of the technological apparatuses of the workspace infiltrating the domestic interior, in the image of domesticity and the construction of identity through the tools and environments of this new domestic space. The paper doll entered my project as a representation of a classical comfort aesthetic, something that is soft and light and flimsy. The juxtaposition between the technological object and the comfort object creates a kind of productive tension that leads to a new kind of paper getting involved, the wallpaper. Wallpaper enters the project as a multifunctional domestic object and as an aesthetic representation of comfort in the domestic interior. But it also begins to suggest flattening, masking, and deception, a shift between the flat surface and three-dimensional space. Wallpaper complicates the relationship between subject and background and provokes one to question what is real space and what is virtual space. In this study here, the wallpaper frames the garage through the shapes of the domestic objects. By freeing the wallpaper from the wall through the act of delamination, we begin to discover that the wallpaper does more than hiding simply cracks and stains, but hides other depths and messes and objects, other realities as well. So here's a video test I made where we see the script playing out in the space of the garage through plugging things in, turning on lights, making a coffee, and printing of images, and shredding of papers, and drinking of coffee. And boiling of water, and making tea, and drinking it. And printing objects, and plugging other things in, and trying to cool down, and heating up food. And eating it. So here we see the wallpaper as it begins to reflect these happenings. At first, the relationship is more static, but begins to act up, behaving in a more temperamental manner, as we begin to see in this vignette. I imagine the moving image as a space where the wallpaper can not only print and scale and cut and layer, but starts to heat or cool or darken or lighten as well. So while this plays out, what I'm thinking going forward is over the next few weeks, I'd like to focus on the synthesis of these parts, to formalize the thin red line and bridge where I am physically with where I am digitally, so that the space of the garage begins to more explicitly enter the digital space and vice versa. A kind of productive collapsing of the space of the physical and the space of the virtual. Ultimately, the thesis aims to question what the possibilities might be for an architectural space that exists outside of the current boundaries and limitations of standardization and optimization, and aims to understand how we construct our identities, our comfort, and our architecture in this new domestic landscape.
Amanda, I see that your title is the title of the essay.
It's the title right now, either that or home office. I kind of haven't really decided, but I like the word temperamental quite a lot. So
you should credit it though, because that's a term that kind of John uses, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
Are you interested in, I mean, you mentioned the home office, but then you also mentioned the garage. I wonder if you're making making distinctions between different programs or typologies within the house or apartment?
I think what I'm more interested in is like specifically just the idea of home mixing with the idea of office. I mean, for me, it's the garage, but that is what I have available. I think the kind of ideas that I'm working with could sort of detach themselves and infiltrate into like other types of home offices that everyone's dealing with, like trying to find those commonalities. I mean, the garage, I would like to come back into the project more explicitly, I think, but what I'm most interested in ultimately with this idea of home office is that for the majority of us, we are now living and working in the space which wasn't explicitly designed to be a home office. It was designed to be a home. And the program of the office kind of infiltrates. And I've been looking a lot at just like the precedent of the Frankfurt kitchen, but what it means to maybe reconsider the Frankfurt kitchen before optimization, so in its pre-stage. I don't know exactly that the project's doing this yet visually, but it's something that I've been thinking about like what it could be or how it might be productive to think of like a space which is not optimized so explicitly, and maybe like what can emerge from that.
And then how are you linking that to the idea of temperament?
Well, I guess when the temperament was most explicitly coming out for me when I was thinking of like the wallpaper beginning to reflect like what's happening in these spaces. And I was thinking a lot about like electrical energy and metabolic processes and ASHRAE and things like this, which kind of fell out of the project, but were with me for a lot of thesis prep. So kind of the dissolution between foreground and background, but also the way that like the wallpaper in one scene begins to heat up and like reflect what is happening in the object, and the wallpaper kind of taking on a life of its own or a personality of its own in these scenes.
Have you read Vermilion Sands?
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of the 1,000 Dreams of Stella Vista, the house that lives out the memories or traumas of its residents and starts to distort and respond. Do you I mean, I feel like maybe there's a way of, maybe there is a connection point to these things, but it does seem like the question of work and home kind of blurring or becoming one and the same kind of category, or like typological confusion, on the one hand seems like an intellectual issue, but like the responsive wallpaper and the kind of J.G. Ballard type references make me think that maybe there's like a more surreal dimension to this. Is that intentional?
Yeah, I think so. I've been thinking a lot about like, I mean, I've been thinking of like looking back to William Morris, of course, like those wallpapers and like those ideas come into the project. But I've also been looking a lot at Kehinde Wiley's work. And I've been reading a lot of articles like from him and watching interviews as well. And he talks explicitly, I think most recently I read in a piece from The Guardian about the influence of both William Morris on his work, but also people like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose early feminist work, The Yellow Wallpaper, was something that I read in high school, I think, and then came back to it and kind of like the influence of like Wiley and Gilman and Morris kind of all together, I think can begin to speak to like the psychological experience of being in these spaces at this time.
Amanda, I wonder if you lost the background to some extent. Like I think the wallpaper was an interesting way of bringing back this idea of the backdrop of the office. And I think in the film, or let's say in the film vignettes or the series, you're mostly working with the stencil, but you're not in the mask, but you're not necessarily bringing the backdrop or the background back into the discussion. So I'm not sure what it would be exactly, whether it would be a kind of fantastical like wallpaper collage, or whether it would be the actual site, which is the garage. I think it probably should be the garage. But if it is the garage, then what is the role, I wonder what is the role of the kind of more dynamic filmic representation of everyday life, like scenes of an everyday life in an office. What's the relationship of that? Or let's say, how does it hold against the backdrop of the garage itself? Like, are these anti-gravitational things floating like stickers, or are there actual repercussions to how you change the garage space based on what you discover in these filmic vignettes? In other words, do you modify the actual interior, domestic interior, based on discoveries that you're making when you make these films? There seems to be, I think maybe you're a little bit agnostic right now to the garage, it seems. Like the presentation has a position in terms of like the lifestyle of an office, but not quite yet, doesn't quite yet have a position about what happens to the office space or the garage itself. So I wonder if this could be the next step.
Yeah, I mean, just to speak to that, I think that's how I like kind of tailed off at the end of the presentation. I think that the garage itself, I don't know exactly how, like I don't have a really successful or explicit technique for it yet, but I think it does need to come back into the project more strongly. And I know the videos don't show that because they were kind of done before I started thinking about this and not really having a good answer. But yeah, it's definitely something to think about the next few weeks.
I'm almost wonder, because you start, the very first image is the green screen, a drop with the kind of elements of a photographic space, like the spotlights, I guess, and the cameras and all that. And I almost wonder how it would look like after all this, after you've gone through these everyday life documentations in an office. Like, does that image change? And things start, maybe you start adding walls, and maybe you add temporary walls, maybe you add temporary doors, maybe there's random door frames in the middle of the office because you need it for a particular scene or everyday scene, or maybe you start to add partitions and tables start to get arranged in strange ways, and chairs, and maybe the coffee machines, I don't know, take on a more like building element role. I don't know. I'm wondering if you could maybe start to intervene in the garage space based on the set that you need to make these films, perhaps. And it's just an idea.
One question I have is just differentiating what you've presented and the kind of domestic space as a living space in a home, and what makes it a home office. Like, it wasn't clear to me what type of work exactly was supposed to be taking place, or that such a setup would facilitate, or if it was, because the images that you showed of actions taking place are what I would consider to be things that I do when I take a break from work, like drinking coffee or making a meal. And then I was thinking maybe the labor or the work is simply living in that space as if it were a stage set for reality TV. But like in some way, it would be helpful to know how it is that you're conceiving of this new type of work, or what kind of labor is taking place in that space.
Yeah, I see. I guess it's something I haven't thought about so explicitly in those terms, because maybe it just seems sort of obvious to me from the beginning, and how I thought about it, that it would be like the really mundane daily rituals of like what it's like to go into the studio space and like perform those kind of in-between actions. So it was never really explicitly about like a kind of divided project or like other piece of work that was inside of that space. It was the work itself, but maybe it's something that needs to become more clear in how I present.
I'm totally smiling in the background because Kavior, I mean, it's exactly studio culture. Like we don't even notice when work is being done, because most of the time we're just kind of drinking coffee and talking to each other. And so in many ways, when Amanda is showing all of these rituals, kind of, to me, it just looks like that's what an architect engages in. Like, how often does an architect actually sit and like hold the mouse? I mean, most of the time we're just watching models grow in our 3D printers and we're taking a break. It's like part of this normal, I guess, of studio life that we've lost quite clearly in this moment. And in many ways, like Zeina's comment about bringing it back to the garage space is something that Amanda and I have definitely been speaking about, to think, like, I posted 2 images by Rainer Banham because in many ways, a home is not a house, in some ways is exactly the parallel to the garage is not a parking space. You know, it's kind of, you come home and all of a sudden, because it's now the office where we Zoom and we work, you've kind of displaced the car for all of these other objects that have to be now wired all together into a loop. And one thing that I find kind of fascinating is that, Amanda, could you bring back the, just for like 30 seconds, the video of the new video of the 9 square where all of these objects are interconnected?
Like share screen right now.
Yeah, if you share it for a moment, I just want to annotate something on top of it because actually, maybe I don't have annotation. Here, annotate. Okay, let's try this. The thing that I wanted to kind of point out is that with Banham, what happens with the home is not a house is a kind of interconnectivity of all of the technology that produces the interior. And here, because of the screens and their separation from one another, I think you want to be like super aesthetic about the connection of like one wire to the next. And the way in which these things actually begin to almost like plug into one continuous, you know, like loop of electrical appliance grids, and how all of that then, and what I'm drawing with my purple line is the black cord, I guess, of this kind of interconnected looped activity that defines the day of, I guess, an architect. And in the backdrop of all of this would be the garage, but, or the wallpaper or what have you as a kind of backdrop. But I imagine that you'd want to really design the electrical loop in order to bring our attention to something like the Banham image of this fully wired garage, like ready to kind of be turned into a studio space. Anyway, so I think that there are certain things that you're doing that are interesting, but just like a little bit, they would need to be quite a bit aestheticized so that it becomes a project in itself, the kind of the visual material.
Well, that also helps clarify the confusion where it's a studio, but then maybe one of the points that is being made is that a lot of what we would consider to be kind of like office work or sort of like non-manual labor is becoming more of like studio production, especially as, you know, like being an influencer has actually become a job, right? Or like reality TV that has become a job in a way that some people create a livelihood for themselves. And so it's like this shift or loosening between the studio and the office.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody. What do you think? We're kind of at the end.
Yeah, I think we're definitely should wrap up. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks to all of our guests who stayed late. Definitely Kavior, Tim. It was really a pleasure to hear from you. Eric as well. Thanks for jumping in. And to all the students, I think today was really awesome.
It was a great project.
Yeah, very good progress today.
Zeina, thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care.